p.m., and I do call this meeting to order. I do want to welcome all of our guests who are joining us today and those who are live streaming the State Board's workshop. Before we go much farther, and I lose my thoughts here, we do have to have the roll call, and we have Erica Light on our staff who will be conducting the roll call. And just a reminder to board members to please turn on your microphone when it's your turn. Thank you.
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell.
Here.
Mr. Eby.
Here.
Mr. Edwards.
Here.
Mr. Ferguson.
Here.
Mr. Hamby. Mr. Jensen.
Here.
Ms. Kim.
Here.
Dr. House. Mr. Morrow. Chairman Hartgrove.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 8 members present.
We have a quorum and we are duly convened. I do have to read a statement that I have to read every time we meet in workshop, and it is this. Pursuant to Section 8 of Policy 1.400, the Board Meetings Policy, workshops are meetings of the State Board sitting as a committee of the whole. Section 1, subsection E of the same policy, in accordance with TCA 8-44-108, requires all votes taken during electronic meetings of the Board to be taken by call of the roll. In accordance with this policy and the law, I move that the State Board dissolve itself into the Committee of the Whole for the purposes of conducting our workshop. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Eby provides the second. Ms. Light, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins.
Aye.
Mr. Darnell.
Aye.
Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards.
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson.
Aye.
Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Kim.
Aye.
Chairman Hartgrove.
Aye.
Madam Chairman, you have 8 ayes.
Thank you. I declare that we are in the Committee of the Whole for the purposes of conducting our workshop. Before we move into the agenda, I've already said welcome to everyone, but I do want to make a comment about being here on the campus of the University of Memphis. We had hoped to be here last year, and as everyone knows, we were delayed in being here because of COVID-19. So we are incredibly thankful for the University of Memphis for hosting us and for their hospitality, and we look forward to meeting with their leadership later this evening when they will be hosting us for dinner. We do have important updates by way of presentations coming before us this afternoon, and before we get into those, I do call on our State Board Executive Director, Dr. Sarah Morrison, for a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just echo your sentiments. It's a pleasure to be here in Memphis with all of you, and thank you to the University of Memphis, to Shelby County this morning for hosting us for some really remarkable school visits, and we look forward to the discussions today as part of our workshop. So just really glad to be together in Memphis for our first out of Nashville meeting since the pandemic. So good to be with all of you.
And I think we have 2 of our board members that are incredibly excited, Mr. Darrell Cobbins and Mr. Larry Jensen, and we're in their territory. So,
and thank you to both for helping in our planning efforts.
Okay. So without further ado, let's go ahead and move into the agenda items, the presentations, and the first one is dual enrollment data trends. Victoria Harpool with the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. Even if I state your name, please state your name and title for the record before you present. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Victoria Harpool. I am the Assistant Executive Director for Academic Affairs and Strategic Alignment at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. Thank you all for having me here today. So I'm with the Higher Education Commission, but we are also, we are sort of sister agencies with the Student Assistance, Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation. So any of the financial aid programs that you hear about are run through the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation. So while we have the same mission, we are technically 2 separate entities. But for these purposes, we're one. This is our mission, is really to work on getting the largest number of Tennesseans with a credential as possible. We know that for Tennessee to thrive economically and for individuals in our state to thrive, that a post-secondary credential is really absolutely necessary for that to become a reality for individuals. So, what to talk about today? I have the pleasure of talking to you today about dual enrollment. So, what is it? Who participates in it? And what are the impacts and outcomes of it? Dual enrollment has grown tremendously in the past decade, and you'll get some numbers as we go. But just in the last decade, there's been an 84% increase in students taking dual enrollment, which we could not be more thrilled about, both from a policy perspective, and you'll see from the outcomes for students what this is able to do for them. So what is dual enrollment? So dual enrollment is exactly what it sounds like. Students are dually enrolled in high school as well as college. The important distinction here is that this runs through the regional accreditor, which accredits the university or community college, so SAC-COC, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, the Commission on Colleges. So these are students that are truly enrolled in the institution. They have access to the library, they have access to the writing center, any of the amenities or abilities that a student would have. They are truly dually enrolled. The staff, the faculty that deliver dual enrollment courses must meet those regional accrediting standards, which for teaching undergraduate courses is a master's degree with at least 18 hours in the content area. So we're talking about content area experts. It can take place on either the college campus or the high school campus, or you can take an online course. So the medium is less of a concern here for the definition. It's more about what students are guaranteed, and that's that they are a student and that they are given the same rigor as that course presented to other students on campus. So from higher ed perspective, when we talk about dual enrollment, this is what we're talking about, and there are very specific implications for these institutions when they offer dual enrollment. To give you an example, at the Tennessee Board of Regents, some of their institutions' dual enrollment students make up 25% of their enrollment. This is a very real operation for them and has very real implications when they have accreditation visits, because this is expected to be part of their institutional effectiveness plan. These students are their students. There's not a difference there. So when we approach this, it's taken very, very seriously, both from what we provide to students as well as accreditation that is taken very seriously by our higher ed institutions. A distinction for our discussion today is the difference between the dual enrollment grant and dual enrollment. So what I just described was dual enrollment. The data that I have available to me through the Higher Education Commission and the Student Assistance Corporation is information about the dual enrollment grant. So those students that utilize the funds available from the state for dual enrollment. Because the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation is who sends out those payments. So we know what students have had what classes for, paid for at what institutions. So this will not capture all of necessarily your ready graduate EPSO indicators. Okay, there might be some students that took a dual enrollment class that didn't use the grant, in which case that would not be captured here. So do want to let you know of that data limitation. So usually I'll let you know when we're talking about the dual enrollment grant data specifically, but that is why there could be some differences in the numbers when what you've seen when it comes to ready graduate. So who's eligible? Oh, I guess first, the program began in 2005, which we're really proud of as a state that we began investing in dual enrollment in 2005. Obviously, you've seen we've had a large uptick. We didn't start with 30,000 students a year participating in dual enrollment, but we're very excited that that's where we are now. So the state offers 2 courses to students. They need to be either a junior or senior, free of charge. Beginning in January of 2022, we're very excited that students will have access to 4 courses now, free of charge. Books are still not part of the package, but they are able to go without tuition and fees, which makes a huge difference for students. And then you have the eligibility requirements there. There is a GPA eligibility requirement that they keep once they are enrolled in dual enrollment, so that they keep a certain GPA at the higher ed institution. But they have to be a junior or senior, meet whatever the entrance requirements are for that institution, and then they can participate. This is another one, and this is a newer program of GIVE that has come about since Governor Lee. So it's the governor's investment in vocational education. So what this opened up was, right now we had the 2 free courses that were usually used for gen ed. This opened up those high needs fields at community colleges and TCATs for students to take 4 of those courses. Now coming up, all students are going to have access to that, which of course we're really glad about. But this was really a step to acknowledge those students that were able to do college work and who wanted to be able to take that college work and parlay it much more quickly into high demand fields and high demand jobs. So this was from academic year 2020-21, so a rough year for everyone, but these are the outcomes we're seeing from the GIVE program, okay? Which we were really, really pleased to see that even in a year that was difficult for everyone, but particularly for K-12, these students were able to engage in that dual enrollment. And here's some of the examples of programs that they're participating in. Okay? These are things that our society, we rely on. I mean, I don't think we can stress the importance of nursing more than we are experiencing right now, but these are very real professions that students are engaging in, and 4 courses, you're very well on your way to being at a credential there, and students can do that while they're in high school. So we're very much excited both for the workforce development that that provides, as well as the outcomes for individual students.
Victoria, is there
Yes,
an
ma'am.
intention over time to continue to increase the number of courses that are offered for free?
We certainly want to see more students participate and to do so as frequently as they can.
Okay.
Can I address
understand.
that?
Yes, sure.
So Senator Yeager, who represents the district that I'm in, he was a force behind going from the 2 to the 4, and we've had a conversation, and he fully continues. I think he's going to push for 6 at the next session until it all gets paid for, because you know, students, after they graduate from high school, they can go to 2 years of free community college. So why should the students in high school have to pay for it? I think that's the message that he brings that makes a lot of sense. So yes, I think there is an effort to do that.
I think that's a very seamless plan.
Exactly. Yeah, I've heard that too over and over again when there are students who are being, it feels like they're being penalized, and I know there have been many discussions about that, so I'm pleased to hear that there's a plan. Let's see how it moves forward in the future and how long it takes to get there.
I can say right now the average number of courses that students take is 1.3. So we don't actually have that many students that are taking advantage of the full 2, though we're very excited that we'll be able to open that up to 4. Though the number of students that are bumping up against that are not as high. We would certainly like to see more students take advantage of all that we're able to offer even now.
And the other part of that equation, excuse me, I would imagine has to do with promotion of it, knowledge that these opportunities even exist. And
Absolutely.
So I would hope that there's a marketing plan somehow embedded in that.
Yes.
So more and more students are aware that the opportunity is there for them.
The other thing that we hope to talk about more is, now that we've been able to do, and I'll share some of this with you, the national research is out there about how dual enrollment impacts students, and it's a really significant impact. But we've been able to do some of that research here in Tennessee with Tennessee students. So we're not talking about the hypothetical here, or we can actually narrow down to Tennessee students in our schools, students that are receiving these grants, what the outcomes look like, and they're certainly significant.
If we're asking questions, can I ask another one then?
I think so, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to go back. You made a comment that not all students were taking advantage of the grant. Why is that?
The students can't use the grant in the summer. So if they really wanted to take a summer course, or if they choose to attend a private university, there is a cap on the funds that are allocated. So if that university or our community, well, all of our public community colleges participate. If the university doesn't cover that gap, they may not find that it's worth to utilize the grant. Up here we have the most common courses that are taken, as you would imagine, your gen ed courses, and they're those that substitute most easily for their high school courses. English for English, history for history. Those are some of the easiest correlations for a counselor to look at and see how this would compare and fit in easily to a high school schedule. Also, we like this idea. Your gen eds are sometimes what students are less engaged in. They want to get to their major. So let's let them do that. Let's let them progress as their skills allow them to. Also, you have some of the students, the same students that we're talking about going into nursing, they can take the anatomy and physiology rather than just the biology 1 and 2. That's actually going to count towards those advanced sciences. So this is a smattering of what those most common disciplines are with some examples of the courses. Certainly that's a little bit different when you're looking at the TCATs, but right now this is the largest grouping of what students are taking.
So, American history. What's the mechanics of a high school student saying, I want to go to Memphis University and take my American history, and I don't want to take American history here at the high school?
So from my understanding is that this is a discussion with the counselor at the high school, and then the student enrolling in the University of Memphis through that dual enrollment. So there's a grant application that
But is there any discretion to deny someone from taking the college credit instead of the high school course?
Not if they meet the grant requirements or the requirements from the post-secondary institution. Any of those concerns would come from the high school counselor or particulars of the individual student. I know sometimes counselors look at chronic absenteeism, that may play into their ability to keep up with the post-secondary coursework, but that is all at the discretion at the high school level. So here's our figures. What I've been saying, it's grown so substantially. It's up there, and we're really, really glad about that. Gone from a little over or almost 17,000 to over 30,000. We have a dip this year. I think we all can understand why that's a little bit more difficult, but we were pretty pleased to see in 1920, one of our most difficult years, we still had rising participation in dual enrollment. And so then this is where students are taking dual enrollment. The vast majority you see are at, or I guess not the vast majority, it's 53%, are taking courses at the public community colleges. Another 15% are at the colleges of applied technology, which some of that boost has to do with the GIVE dual enrollment grant. Then you've got the independent 4 years, and then the red are your 4 years. So you're looking over half at the community colleges, but certainly you have some public and private 4 years participating in the program. So here's a national look. So this is information from Columbia University that they have pulled and analyzed as who's participating in dual enrollment. From a national perspective, we're not that far off of what the national average looks like. However, I mean, I think we're all in this room pretty dedicated to not being content with just hitting the average. But this is what we looked like in 2017-18. You can see white females are substantially more likely to participate in dual enrollment than are African American males. So we certainly, and I think Chairman Hargrove hit on this, is we need to find a better way to speak about this, to explain what it is. I mean, I think when you see some of the outcomes, they're compelling. for counselors, for parents, for principals as to why you would want to engage in this. But I do think that there's a communication that needs to occur that perhaps isn't right now when we see that the average uptake is 1.2, 1.3 courses for students, when at this point 2 are available free of charge to the student. So to give you a little bit broken down, and this is dual enrollment grant data, students who participate are more likely to be white females that are highly academically prepared. Interesting, rural students are more likely to take dual enrollment as opposed to our urban students. But all of this speaks to we as a collective education community, K-12, higher ed, we need to do a better job of engaging these students. I'm talking about the great outcomes and their outcomes by these subgroups. But if we're not engaging these students, we're leaving students behind that need to be engaged, right? That are very capable, that we're not providing to. And so I think that's part of this discussion, is that we all be better versed in what is available and then how we can do a better job of bringing it to students.
So in sitting here and listening to this, unless there's a well-executed plan to ensure that everybody knows their role in high school, in lower grades, when do we start promoting this? When do we start breaking the barriers, breaking through? And it's not just their job, it's everybody's job. So who's in charge? Who's on point?
The department runs EPSO Week. So we start young. My student, first grade in metro schools in Nashville, is talking about college going. So I know that we're talking about EPSOs and getting college started early, but it's never too early is the answer. We also have at THEC is the Gear Up and the college advising, the Tennessee advisors. But no, I think us working together, that's exactly part of what we need to be doing, is have higher ed and K-12 coordinate so that we can not only get the information out, but then, to Mr. Edwards' point, get them enrolled. Let's do this and actually have them engage in the content.
And sometimes, too, it's the education of those that are in the school system as well. And so it's how do we go about that? And so I think we need to sink our teeth into that and come up with a solution to ensure that that's happening, because I've heard it directly from counselors who say, I don't know about these things. There are teachers who do not know about these things, and who spends the most time with these students, and they're a captive audience. So I think we have a lot more work to do, clearly.
One of the resources that we do have available is the staff from the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation and our outreach team have webinars in the fall and the spring, depending on if we were looking at doing dual enrollment or we're filling out the FAFSA or filling out Tennessee Promise, that they'll actually walk parents and counselors through how to fill out some of these forms, including line by line of the FAFSA, which if you haven't engaged with the FAFSA recently, it's something that having help is definitely something you want. But yes, I think more of that is absolutely what we've got to do, is get the information in the hands of parents and counselors to be able to make some of these decisions for their students.
Thank you. Mr. Eby?
One of the things you haven't mentioned is the middle college program, and I know several districts across the state participate in that. I actually got to participate in the graduation ceremonies at Rhode State in May, where 73 students got their 2-year degree a week before they got their high school degree. And so I think that's one way we can promote that program, is get more districts participating in that middle college, now particularly since courses are being offered free of charge.
And that has been something that we've heard both outstanding that the middle colleges have been able to do, but also a challenge right now is with the dual enrollment, the number that are available to students free of charge. So we're very glad that those additional courses are coming into play, because asking students who are working so hard to get that associate's credential at the same time as their high school diploma, that's a big ask. That is not currently funded through the dual enrollment grant.
You don't get a sense, though, that there are decision makers who think this is a bad idea. I'm trying to figure out where the pushback would be. If you're looking at the whole, if we shorten anywhere between 1st and 16, anywhere we start pulling out money, it's going to save the whole, right? So why is it a challenge for people to be able to look outside their one pot of money?
So one of the things that I can let you know is that there are a host of EPSOs available to districts. And so some districts have a preference for AP or IB as opposed to dual enrollment. So, and we support that suite of early access for students. But, of course, I'm a big fan of dual enrollment and having students engaged with the faculty that they will have very well the next year after they graduate high school, would be the same faculty member.
Just have one question. Want to make sure I'm clear. 2 slides back on the 27-18 academic year, the national versus Tennessee. Are those, at least the top 2, are those percentages based on students that are eligible?
That's students altogether.
Okay. Do we have data
Which
that
if we-
shows?
I'm sorry.
Do we have data that shows of those students eligible, what percentage actually?
So that's something that we can do with the Department of Ed. Well, we know the ACT score is running about 20, which is one of the ways that you could be eligible, but that's certainly something we can dig into. I can tell you right now, we're not getting dual enrollment-wise all of the students that could. Now, some of that, maybe they're taking AP, they're in IB, they're in Cambridge, but that's some of the work that we can do with the department to see who's engaging in an EPSO, and that's been done before. I just don't have that at hand.
I like to see us compared on a national average. I wonder how that is if you compared us on a southeastern average. I bet you we would be much higher. I don't know.
I can pull that up when I sit down. That
Okay.
that national data is publicly available. I can pull that up and let you know.
I'd just like to know that. Thanks.
So some pictures of what dual enrollment classrooms can look like. So this is from the MMPS, so in Metro. These are some of the students engaged. In this instance, they're on the higher ed campus, but very much engaged in the coursework that they're doing. Nothing like learning a subject by doing it. Always, we know that that's the most effective way to have students retain knowledge is to use the knowledge. So always very excited to see that. This is one, a project from the GIVE dual enrollment. So very glad to see students in the agriculture fields. You know, they're doing the work in these ag business courses. They're getting out into the field and working with that equipment. Be hard to simulate driving that tractor, but you know, she's doing it. And what we know is that agriculture is becoming more and more engaged and intertwined with technology. So having students, and that's one of the things that the GIVE opportunity does. It's a two-pronged program. One is the dual enrollment piece. One is the community grant piece that allows high schools and colleges of applied technology and community colleges to purchase equipment, so that students actually are working on that real equipment that they're going to see when they engage in the workforce.
So I have a question. We were at Mitchell High School this morning, and one of the folks told us that they needed 100 teachers in STEM to get from 3,900 certificates to 10,000 of some kind of training. We've got this, we've got TCAT, we have CTE, and is there a place where all this is being looked at sort of comprehensively? For example, we're, the Ford plant that's going in out here is 5,000 new jobs. And I know they're going to put a TCAT on that campus, is what I understand, but where is this being looked at from a sort of a macro perspective? And y'all are doing a wonderful job, and it's great and wonderful, but I have no sense about the comprehensiveness of this. And is there somewhere that's being done? And if not, do we need to think about how we get there?
Well, I think that's something that's coming up in the workforce that was created that perhaps Executive Director Morrison can speak to look. We have this moment in COVID where we're looking at what occurred and what best practices can we learn from that going forward. So I think you're exactly right, a movement and a push to be more comprehensive about this, both in how we engage in it and who we engage. And having higher ed talk to K-12 is a vital part of that.
You've also got the Department of Labor.
Absolutely.
You've got the
Economic and workforce
economic development
Yep.
folks. We've got, it's going on all over the place, and I don't know if the right word is a clearinghouse or a think tank that's sitting down and looking at this comprehensively. It just seems like we're in such a great opportunity in the state, and not that, I don't mean to say this to you, but it just seems a bit fragmented. And maybe that's wishful thinking to think that we could somehow take this comprehensively and look at the components of it and see where we need to align and where we need to, to really look at the product. I know I've said this in here before. We've got some understanding that if you look statistically, 50% of our children are not going to college. And are we preparing them through this type of thing to be well prepared? And 50% of our children that's a lot of kids that we really need to think about. And I know we are, but it just seems to me it's a little over here and some over there and a lot over here. And it would just seem to be helpful if we could somehow sit down and look at it comprehensively.
You're absolutely right. This was happening in silos before, and may have returned to silos. But when I was working in workforce development under economic development for a local economic development agency, there was a move afoot, and there was a person within the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, she may still be there, who was to bring all of the various, I want to say silos, departments of government together, workforce and economic development, and also bringing in the TDOE and other areas to address this comprehensively so that everybody was working together on it. But they had one point person who was working for the Commissioner of Workforce, of Economic and Community Development. We need to validate if that still exists, because if it does, then we need to have, we need that knowledge, and we need to have a comfort level that they're doing the work that we think that they should be doing. Not that we have oversight for them, but it does directly affect what we're trying to do on our part with the TDOE and with the school systems. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I was thinking this earlier just in the other conversation about how do we make sure that all students have access? How do we make sure that somebody's responsible and making sure all the right stakeholders come together to do their part to ensure that we're moving the needle in the right direction?
We ought to at least see their work product.
Say that again?
We ought to at least see their work product.
Yes.
If it exists, we ought to know what it says.
And
So the
it may
Tennessee
not exist
Pathways
anymore, but let's
team-
find out.
I'm sorry.
This
You go
head
ahead.
of the CTE for Shelby County Schools said, you give me 100 teachers that are qualified, and I can get you 10,000 students qualified. And so
It's a
I
capacity
mean, to
issue.
me, that's not an easy thing to do, but I like that ratio. And so my question is, where are we doing this? And is there anything we can do to press this issue?
I think so.
I do think, it's a matter of the state level, sort of someone feeling responsible, because there are so many different parties involved. And there's different workforces involved in terms of intergovernmental and industry partnerships. We have better data, I think, than we've ever had about sort of industry-needed pathways. What does industry need? Where are the jobs going to be? But I do think, I mean, your example is a great one, and that's more of a micro conversation probably in the Memphis area about preparation, piece, like the pipeline. Where is that breaking down in terms of what the district needs? But I certainly think the state could do more to facilitate those conversations. So yeah, I mean, this is exciting, and I do feel like it's an area where the governor really has, enthusiasm, has put some money and energy, and so, hopefully we can continue the momentum and figure out sort of what the state board's role is in trying to promote more cohesiveness across the different, as we call EPSOs, these early post-secondary opportunities, of which dual enrollment is one, but really making sure that they're not just sort of scattershot on a student's resume, but really are driving towards more of these industry credentials that will translate into real jobs for students, whether that's through a 4-year degree going to college or a 2-year degree or some combination.
And I think where we put our stake in the ground with ESSA on the Ready Graduate and making EPSOs something that we've acknowledged as a state that are important, because we've seen the data and we've seen how important it is for students. So I do think that there's an appetite for that conversation and to make sure that the EPSOs that we're providing are right for the individual student and that they're building towards something. And I do think, to Chairman Hargrove's point, there's some local and regional aspects to that as well, that I think we get some of the Tennessee Pathways coordinators that are engaging in that work to make sure we know that students don't go to college all that far from their own homes. So if we want to make sure that they are engaged productively in the economy, we need to make sure that those local markets, that they're prepared for those as well.
And I'm not trying to diminish anything you're doing or criticizing. It's just this stepping back a little bit and asking the question. So I want to encourage you. Thank you for what you're doing. It's very important.
Okay, so now some of the exciting stuff is the outcomes of dual enrollment. So their exposure to higher education. They are a higher education student, both to the institution. They get an idea of what that TTH on their schedule means. Let's not have them figure that out when they're 18. And they're just walking in the door for the first time, that they have a Tuesday, Thursday class, as well as the rigor of the curriculum. I know we laugh, but but we get Tennessee Promise students that'll ask, what's TTH? They went on Monday and we're like, well, I guess the class isn't meeting. That's Tuesday, Thursday. Please go back tomorrow. But that kind of knowledge that those of us who've been through post-secondary just know, a lot of students don't. And so this is as real as it gets, okay? And to the rigorous curriculum. For those students that are prepared for post-secondary curriculum while they're in high school, let's go ahead and get them started. This is what the rigor looks like. You are with a college faculty member, likely on a college campus. This is what that experience is going to be like. Transcribed credit. You have a transcript. There's, you pass the class. Well, I guess even if you don't, you get a transcript. But you have a transcript of credit of what college course you took, and able to apply that. To give you an idea, now this is the 53% that are at the community colleges, but you're looking at over 90% of the students making a C or better. So they've got a transcript with 3 hours, in that case, of college credit. Okay? Over 90%. So we're talking about, now that's one of the populations, but a high success level, which is educators' formative iterative assessments, rather than that one day, that one morning when you get a semester to evolve your work over, is going to translate into credit. Also those soft skills. Now this is coming out of the University of Texas. I have to watch now to say UT, that this is UT Austin, not UT Knoxville. But they did a large scale study over Texas and saw, in addition to some of the exposure, with the soft skills, being on time, writing professional communications to your professors, engaging in some of those skills that we want students to learn and that we can get through or get to with some of those workforce development opportunities. they can do in these post-secondary experiences, as well as the self-efficacy. They believe they can do work because in this instance, 90% of them at the community colleges that were prepared for work did it. They were successful. So there's a lot of belief that goes into a student that they can do it, and we know that that translates then they enroll. Students who participate in dual enrollment are more likely to graduate and to enroll in a post-secondary institution. 24% more likely. And this is Tennessee data. This isn't national data. These are our students. So for us, this is pretty stark. This is our call to action from what we see of exactly of what you're talking about is we need to get, if this is this impactful, we've got to get this in the hands of more folks to know what students are eligible and how they access these funds. This is if you took and boiled it down to 100 students, the 10th graders from the class of 2010 to 2017. The big thing here is you see the gray. Those are the ones that didn't enroll in post-secondary. You see two very different groups of those who entered, those who engaged in dual enrollment and those who didn't.
I think I'm jumping back, but if we're trying to figure out, the game is getting people thinking about it, understanding that there's the grants available, and figuring out the whole navigating to get there. And we now have, 30,000 plus doing it. Are those, if you were to map them, are they clustered together? In other words, where you see people taking advantage of the system, are there a lot of people taking advantage of the system and then there's a desert over here where there's nothing happening?
There may be of dual enrollment because like some counties very much prefer AP. So when we do a map of dual enrollment, you'll see deserts. But if you overlay, and like I said, we've done this, the research is several years old, so I wouldn't point to it. I think with the rapid growth that we've seen, it bears looking at it again, of is there an EPSO desert there that do students at least have access to some early post-secondary opportunity?
Well,
but you do get districts with preferences.
So some counties prefer
Advanced placement.
yeah, advanced AP or IB or whatever. And therefore, they kind of discourage and certainly don't promote dual enrollment.
That could be something that occurs.
Well, let's go with it. It could be, okay? I'm thinking it probably does. But, all right, but if you get back to the economics to the taxpayer, every quarter hour that you diminish taking one, so you don't have to double it up, it may not be the school's loss or gain, but the overall cost to taxpayer is diminished because you're only really having to take one class one time. So why is it within a district's purview to sandbag anything based on its personal likes and dislikes?
Well,
One of those hand grenades in the
I'm
middle of the room?
I'm going to go a step farther than I was going to bring this up. Your point on the economics is students who are in those dual enrollment courses, they shorten their time, whether they're getting a 2-year degree,
Oh,
or
yeah,
4-year
that's what-
degree, or whatever. So they're out into the working world sooner. So they're basically their salary opportunity for the life of their working world is much greater. I mean, economically, it makes all the sense in the world to to offer EPSOs and get people involved in classes.
So should we be thinking as a state and everybody who plays a role in it more about how to, one, market it, for want of a better word, and two, in such a way that people know that it's no longer going to be looked upon favorably to be negative toward it? Or,
I'm going to jump in for you, Victoria, but just because I think, I was thinking about a similar sort of issue, Mike, in terms of how do you get aligned incentives for districts to really feel compelled to put more students in, whether it's dual enrollment or AP or IB, any of these what we call EPSOs that are basically have similar research basis to show that if students in high school take some of these early post-secondary opportunities in high school, they're more likely to persist and succeed after high school. I think our accountability system is designed to do that. We haven't really run accountability in the traditional way in the last few years for all the reasons that we've all lived through. But really putting some healthy pressure on districts and schools, and we talked about counselors a lot at our July meeting and the huge role that counselors play, and what additional role could teachers play, whether it's through an additional micro-credential or some way that we can get more teachers into sort of the advising headspace, because every educator that the student comes in contact with, most predominantly their teachers, are part of the marketing of these courses, I think, in the middle school and high school. I mean, Victoria, you could speak to this more, but in terms of why some areas are doing dual enrollment versus AP, some of it's access, I think. Like you said, rural districts are often more situated towards a TCAT and maybe have more of a partnership that's explicit and known than some of our urban areas. But it's not necessarily that it's just dual enrollment that we want to push students into. It's really all of these early post-secondary opportunities, and how do we create incentives for districts and educators to be more of sort of the cheerleaders and helping students to access and enroll.
Well, one factor that's a disincentive that I'd like to understand is dual enrollment versus AP. They don't get that extra half bump up on their GPA. And so
Yes,
if
sir.
they're trying to go to, Harvard or something like that, they get penalized for taking dual enrollment. I know that there was a lot of discussion on that recently. Are we going to correct that situation, or?
I believe that's in state board rule.
It is a topic of current conversation. I mean, there are reasons historically why that has been the case. It's basically around perceived rigor, and we've had districts who have said, don't you dare, give equal credit to AP and dual enrollment because they're not the same in our area, but I think it's one that we need to reconsider. I know Amy's had conversations with stakeholders, with Victoria including, about maybe revisiting that, because you do want to create incentives for all of these college-bearing courses, essentially.
I'd like for us to look at
Bob
that.
wants to spearhead that movement. Amy, take note.
He said he was going to make a motion, which is not allowed. Which is not allowed. Not allowed. And Victoria, thank you so much, because I know we're throwing a lot at you, and it's not you and you alone in this body of work, so we understand that. I know your time is almost up, but we don't want to cut you short, so I think we can move on to the next part of the presentation.
Is some of the longer term impacts. Higher college going rates, higher college persistence, a lot of the same things that we just talked about are made mention of, even than their non-dual enrollment peers. So yes, we know students that are generally academically prepared are engaging in early post-secondary opportunities, but even compared to those peers that were of the same academic standing coming out of high school, they're still having these outcomes that are above. And then we also see them across different demographic groups. Okay, that middle student is actually where we see the largest impact of dual enrollment. That student that maybe was on the bubble of going to college or not, having early access to EPSOs makes a significant difference for them. In addition, that first generation student, both academically and the social capital that we have, having been through post-secondary and knowing who to ask, knowing what the bursar's office is, that you need to talk to the registrar what a seat card is, although actually is a seat card a thing anymore? I don't know. We used to have to get them signed. All of that is increased, not just across averages, but across these subgroups as well. And the impact on completion. Now, this is Tennessee students. And if you engage in dual enrollment, these are how much more likely, your percentage point increase of likelihood of graduation. So we're talking some major impacts on students. And your Tennessee Promise application is due November 1st. But particularly Twitter is where you'll get a lot of our outreach information that our outreach team does. All of those webinars are posted online about FAFSA and Tennessee Promise and the dual enrollment grant that they run through both for teachers and counselors and students to try to make more known that those are available. We also have a call-in line that someone will walk you through that information and those forms if you need. But if you don't know the number, you're going to have a hard time calling it.
Let me ask a question about the promise applications that are due in November. What % of the students just fail to do that? I know a particular personal case of a relative who, you can't light a fire underneath them or something like that. But and I know counselors really push this, but what % of the students miss the opportunity for the Tennessee Promise that could get it?
So I am not the numbers on this, but or I'm not the numbers person on Tennessee Promise, but the majority of students meet this November 1st deadline. Where we start seeing the pipe leak is when you have your meeting with your mentor, and then when the community service hours are due. The times that we have less direct control and we can put students in the library and say, okay, this is what we're doing right now as we're filling out our Tennessee Promise application. The other is the drop-off after FAFSA and the students that don't complete the FAFSA. And we've already started doing it at THEC and TSAC, the FAFSA Frenzy Days, where we go into high schools and help students complete the FAFSA. And one, it's not easy. But two, it requires a lot of documentation that students and parents don't always have at hand. So while we're there, we can help, but the forms are not intuitive if you have to do them alone.
I know that was one thing that Senator Alexander tried to do, is get it to one page or something like that. And I don't know if anybody's still trying to push that through, but it would help.
I would hope a less complicated system was possible.
I just want to say thank you. Victoria is always such a great partner for this board and our staff, and I was really glad to have the opportunity to hear directly from you today on this topic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Victoria. Very informative. Next up is Dr. Sarah Morrison to provide us with some information on average measurable objectives.
All right. Yes, so I have just a moment on the agenda to talk about something that we have, I know, spoken with all of our board members about as part of our preparation for this meeting, but it actually involves something that's not on the agenda tomorrow, but is worth noting for a couple reasons that I'll go into. Those of you that were with us in July may remember towards the end of our meeting, we had an item about annual measurable objectives, AMOs, that was presented by the department that generated a lot of discussion. There were numerous questions that at the time were hard to answer, in part because we were still awaiting the release of last year's TCAP data, 2021 data, coming out the week after our meeting. And as a result of the questions and the sort of immediacy of the next data release, this board voted to delay voting on that item from July to October. You will see, though, it's not on the meeting tomorrow, and we'll talk about that again at tomorrow's meeting. But that was in part because of what's happened subsequently. So let me take you through just a little bit of the timeline since July in terms of how this item has evolved. Following our discussion at the July meeting, the state board staff, state board members, department staff heard from all kinds of folks across the state, namely directors of schools, charter leaders, but certainly other stakeholders as well. And the totality of the feedback really was around trying to use 2021 data, which was released right after our meeting and showed a very high participation rate. Roughly 95% on average of our students participated in TCAP last year, which was more than we expected and exciting to see, but wanted to use that data as the baseline for setting AMOs for this school year. And just a reminder, AMOs, the annual measurable objectives, essentially captures 2 data points in time. So you're setting kind of your baseline starting point, and what districts and charter leaders wanted to say was, let's use 2021 data as our starting line. Let's measure our progress this academic year, 21-22, and determine sort of how we've met our targets based on those 2 points in time. What was proposed in July was using 18-19 as a baseline, and we'll talk about the reasons why that was proposed as such. So hearing that from so many constituents, both the department and the state board staff sort of exhausted our legal counsel in-house and sort of external to the state board. And the conclusion was that the way Public Chapter 2, which is the hold harmless law that passed last special session in January, the way it's written, it doesn't allow TCAP data from 2021 to be used in AMOs. And there's some fine print in there that I could go into, but suffice to say, it's sort of complicated. It was not, we don't believe, the intent of the law, but the way it's written, it really does preclude this board from using that data, our legal counsel believes, in the way that the law is currently constructed. So without a change in the law, it would be hard to use 2021 and have a strong legal defense behind it. So as a result of all of this somewhat confusion and again attempts to try to figure out the path forward, the department convened a working group which met on October 4th. Bob and I were part of that working group, as were the education chairs on the House and the Senate sides, several other stakeholders representing districts like Dale Lynch from TOSS. We had really good conversations at that meeting. The department presented at the time what they believed to be possible options for how to set AMOs within the current legal parameters. But as a result of that conversation, the folks on the call, primarily Chairman White, said, none of these really are the way we want to set AMOs. We need to change the law and to be able to use 2021 data in the way that our constituents were asking. So following that meeting, Chairman White sent a letter to Chairman Hartgrove, which I've sent to all of you, requesting both that the department delay presenting an item to the board and the board delay voting on said item until he could run a bill that would clarify the intent of Public Chapter 2 such that we could use 2021 data as the baseline measure for AMOs this year. We've also since then received a resolution that I sent to you as well from TOSS, reiterating their support for that plan, understanding why we would delay a vote on this item until the law could be changed, and also recognizing that Plan B would still be to use 1819. We certainly hope that Chairman White is successful, and we will all be working with him to advance that legislation. But if it's not to pass, then legally we would still be bound to set AMOs for this academic year. And since we didn't have data in 1920, the most recent year of data would be 1819 in terms of Plan B baseline. So it's most likely that this board will need to come together in the spring in a special called meeting to set those AMO targets, hopefully after the law has been changed, but prior to the end of this academic year, so that districts will have that sort of formally determined before the end of the academic year. The only other thing that I would add is that in working with the department, they have ensured, both through the item that was presented in July and subsequently information that they're sharing with districts this fall, that districts have both kind of draft calculations at their disposal in terms of planning and monitoring their progress for this year. So they have draft calculations using 1819 as a baseline. They also have, or will have soon, the draft calculations using 2021 data. I think that's important just in terms of their operations this year and knowing kind of what the targets Plan A and Plan B would be pending the legislative change. So I know this has racked my brain for the last few months. That's a lot of information. I'll stop. Bob, Lillian, you've been more intimately involved in these conversations. If you have anything else you want to add, or if there's questions that members have, I'm happy to take them.
I think that you articulated it very well from my perspective. I believe Mr. Eby has something he wants to add. How unusual is that? Have to have some humor here.
I would just say that I think this is a great example of how the department, the board, TOSS, the legislature are all coming together, and hopefully what will come out of this will be a collective, a new law that will be beneficial to move this state forward, but we're all coming together to work toward the betterment for the students, and I think this was a great example of that.
This is just a comment. I do appreciate the department working to get that information out, because as a school leader, as a teacher, as a district leader, it's extremely important that you know where the goal is. Well, at least two goals, right? Two goals that you're trying, and hopefully the use of 2021, because as you're taking benchmarks and you're working toward these, you know, okay, we're closing in on that. So let's just work a little harder here, a little harder there. So I do appreciate the transparency with the numbers and being able to have those earlier than it would be once we get to spring, because by that point we're already taking the TCAP. So just sharing my appreciation for that.
Yep. It's worth noting too, I mean, I actually think it's probably most instructive for districts to have both sets of data, because if you think about 18-19, that was our pre-pandemic sort of dipstick. And that's still where we want to get to as a state. We need to accelerate, and we've got all kinds of efforts that are, we hope, hopefully putting students on that path. But, you know, and then 2021 is during the pandemic, so it's a more realistic sort of recent snapshot. But they're both going to be important data points, I think, for districts to be thinking about as they're tracking their progress over the next few years.
Any other questions or comments? Very good. Thank you. We do have on the agenda to take a 15-minute break. Is that the desire of this group to take a break? Sure. Raise your hand. Okay. We will take a 15-minute break as of this moment, and we will return at 2:15. Thank you. Agenda is a 2021 TN Ready data update from Dr. Lisa Kuntz and Mr. Jack Powers. As I said before, I state your name, but please state your name for the record. Thank you so much. I now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jack Powers. I'm the Director of Policy at the Tennessee Department of Education, and I'm joined by Dr. Lisa Kuntz, our Chief Academic Officer. And today, we are going to speak a little bit about TN Ready data, as well as some of the work that the department is doing related to student learning loss remediation. But before we do get started, I want to start this presentation as we do all of our presentations by grounding us in the department's strategic priority areas of academics, student readiness, and educators. After going through TN Ready data with you all today from the 2020-2021 school year, I think you will see that the statewide
Thanks. I feel much better. when I'm talking to other chief academic officers because I feel like we are much further. And that is a testament to the hard work that everybody has put in to make sure our children weren't lost during the pandemic. Both our schools and our families demonstrated that commitment to our children. And you're going to see that as we go through the data. They really, truly mitigated a great deal of the loss that we didn't see. And our data could be much worse, and it is much worse in some states. So I want to start with just saying that I am incredibly thankful for our teachers, for our principals, for our districts, for wrapping around our kiddos and really providing flexible opportunities for all children to learn last year. And I really think that has made a lot of difference in how quickly our students are starting to pick up pace this year. So I want to start with, we have had 2 years of strong test administration. It was a challenge to offer test administration last year. It was much different. You had students who were remote, students who were in blended environments, but it's an incredible testament, again, to the work that we had 95% participation rate in our state. I want to mention that that means we know where we are. There are a lot of states that have a lot lower rates of participation that they don't actually know what the true data is. So the data that we're sharing with you today, I feel really good that this data tells us a true picture of where we are and helps us make very intentional, targeted decisions based on what our data is telling us. So that 95% participation rate means a great deal. And it really tells us that we have fidelity in this data that we're looking at for TCAP and has an ability for us to make very intentional decisions, both at the state level, but at that district, that school, and that student level, we have good data to make good decisions with. And that is due to that 95% participation rate. As we think about what we were testing kiddos who were in hybrid models, which means some kiddos were going to school in person, some children were going to school in remote. Some districts had that remote and hybrid option of in-person, for some and remote. Some of our districts were primarily in-person all year long. So they primarily had all of their students in person unless a student was quarantined or became ill. The primary mode of delivery for instruction was in person. And then we had several districts who had a majority of the year that were remote. All of those districts were assessed in that 95% participation rate. The one area that we do not have in that 95% participation rate is our students with disabilities who have alternative assessments. So when we're looking at this data, this is our traditional TCAP data. To make sure we got to that participation rate, we really had to be intentional about how that TCAP assessment administration window happened. We knew from our districts that we needed to have off-site testing locations for our students who might have been in a remote setting all year long. We had to increase flexibility for those testing schedules. We had to expand the testing window to make sure that districts could do all of those additional testing sites. I want to shout out to those people who aren't here who run our Assessment and Accountability Office. They were on the phone constantly supporting districts, providing exceptional customer service to make sure districts had what they needed to get that participation rate where it was. And then to our districts who made sure they set goals, they mastered those goals and they went way above those goals to make sure we have this data. So we had a very successful administration, but it took a lot of work to get there, to get to that 95%. So when we look at our data, we are looking at a 95% state TCAP rate, and all of our districts across the state met that 80% hold harmless target. So we have 80% of every single district with an average over 95% of that data. That's the very good news that I am completing sharing. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the combined proficiency of what we saw. So when we look at our data, we think blue is mastered. When we look at that light green yellow color, that is our on-track group of students. And when we look at the peach color, you're going to see approaching, and the red color is below. So we're going to look at a lot of charts over the next 20, 30 minutes. I just want to ground and level set us in those colors because you're going to see a lot of different changes in those colors in the graphs. So if we look at our overall combined proficiency for 2021, we are at 30%. When we look at our student groups for our overall combined proficiency rate, we are seeing significant differences with our economically disadvantaged students, our urban and suburban students, our English language learners, and our students of color. As we go through each content area, as we go through those student groups, you're going to see that pattern persist as we go through ELA, math, science, and social studies data. But as we look at this data, one of the wonderful things about that 95% participation rate is you're going to see solutions that are targeted to the specific data. As Jack said, we had special session, we had the Learning Loss and Remediation Act, which set forth our summer programming. It also gave us the opportunity to think about tutoring and high dosage tutoring. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And it gave us strategic investments in our Reading 360 for our earliest literacy learners, Tennessee All-Core, which is our grant program for tutoring, that innovative high school, student support grants, grow your own to make sure we have capacity in our educator workforce, and family resources. I think one of the biggest things we've learned is we have to equip our families as partners, and we are working intentionally to really think about how our families become partners in this learning. So when we look at those student group results, you can see very clearly the differences over time as well, that we have had gaps persist over the past 5 years. But what we know is those gaps widened very quickly when we were in the pandemic. So we have 5 years of data with variant student groups, but each of our student groups clearly experienced the pandemic differently, and the learning loss is different by student groups. As we think about the districts across the state, and then we think about the schools across the state, and the classrooms and the students, every student had a different learning experience last year, which means every student has a different learning loss profile from last year. So it's important for us to really think about that very specific targeted approach at learning acceleration. And I'm going to very intentionally make a learning acceleration versus learning remediation approach when we talk about those strategic and intentional supports for students. It's not about moving them backwards, it's about moving our students forward and moving them forward at an accelerated rate. So we're going to talk through those approaches as we talk through the data today. When we think about that operating model, when we think about in-person, hybrid, and remote across our elementary, middle, and high school, and this is still that combined proficiency rate, we see a very different picture in those bars. If you look at our elementary data, we had a very different experience for those kiddos who had a remote learning experience. We are in a very different place with mastered, on track, significantly different place with approaching and remote in our elementary setting when we combine that data. When we look at our middle school, we have a little bit less of an impact, but we still have over a third of our students that are in that below category, and another 40% of our students in the approaching category. And then in the high school, you see a little bit less in the upper bars, but you still see a large level of that below. So as we think about the different settings that our students experienced learning last year, it had a significantly different impact in their TCAP results. And most importantly, in our elementaries.
How did you define hybrid? I can understand in-person and I can understand remote, but when a student maybe moved in and out, how would you know which category to put them in?
So it wasn't the student, it was the district profile model and how they reported to us if they had those options. So if a district had an option for you to stay at home the whole time and a district had an option for you to be in person, the district is classified as hybrid. This isn't student level, so it's the district delivery model. So when we think about districts who were delivering parallel models, they were considered hybrid. A district that primarily delivered remote, this is their data on the right-hand side.
So then that basically is just a definition. We really don't know
By
down
student?
to the next level how the districts would determine whether a person was hybrid or in-person or remote totally or whatever.
I think we have some tracking at the district level. I don't know how clean that data is, given we were in the pandemic.
Sure.
And they were trying to find a lot of children for part of the year.
Right.
So,
I mean, that's the
Yep.
challenge is thanks.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Just because the district that they were in person, that was their model. They had students that did go remote because they shut down, they implemented their continuous learning plan, and they would still be captured in the in-person category because that was their primary model, correct?
That's correct. That is
what I
correct.
thought. Thank you.
Yep. Very well said. So we're going to dig in a little bit deeper, and we're going to look at English language arts. And we're going to talk through overarching, we're going to talk through elementary, middle, and then we're going to talk through those student groups. So anytime you want to pause and ask a lot of questions, I'm happy to talk through that in more detail. When we look at our overall student data for ELA, we've been sitting in that middle range for a long time. We've talked about it. I've got the opportunity to talk to you quite a bit, but you'll notice that we only have 3 in 10 of our students proficient, and we dropped an overall 5 points from 2019. When we think about those proactive pieces, we have summer programming, we have the Literacy Success Act that Jack talked about, we do have a wealth of resources inside Reading 360, our Tennessee All-Core. We are also seeing very personalized reading supports within district networks, and we'll dig into those proactive solutions that have been in place since last spring to try and support our districts and our students. When we look at by band, this is going to become very important as we get into ELA math, science, and social studies. We have a significantly different story in elementary, and in particular our 2nd and 3rd grade students. When we look at our 2nd grade students, 68% are scoring below, and we increased 47% of 3rd graders. I want to talk a little bit about what the ELA TCAP measures for a second. It's not how well our kids can read. The TCAP in 2nd and 3rd grade measures how well they can read, how well they can comprehend, and then what they do with what they comprehend, how they write, how they answer questions, how they apply that knowledge. And when we talk a little bit about this versus the Universal Reading Screener, the Universal Reading Screener measures can they read. So that data that we're starting to collect this year talks about can students read. So when we compare the Universal Reading Screener data, once we start getting that data in and getting it collected, we'll be able to compare that to can students read, comprehend, and do things, which is our TCAP data. So what we're seeing here in our 2nd and 3rd graders is that they struggled to read, comprehend, and do tasks. And as we move across the grade bands, what we saw in our high school students in particular is a challenge to do writing and writing conventions, which is that applied understanding of what they're reading. So as a whole, when we look at our data across grade bands, we saw a significant drop with our 2nd and 3rd graders. We saw a strategic drop across, not a strategic, but a categorical drop across the board around that writing and writing conventions, that applied ability to comprehend and do tasks with what they have read. One clear student group that is standing out in our data as a significant drop is our economically disadvantaged students. We only have 1 in 7 of our economically disadvantaged students meeting that grade level expectation across the board. When we look at all other students, you see a significantly different picture in our student results from last year and over time.
Excuse me, I want to go back one slide.
Sure.
When you said you had those large drops in the reading and then on up in the writing and conventions, I was looking at the slide before when it had your proactive state solutions. Which one of those addresses sort of the writing and the comprehension?
Yep, so one of the things that in Reading 360 that we have, as I think I've told y'all, it's like a cheesecake factory menu. One of the focus areas is called a Literacy Implementation Network. That part of Reading 360 is from a federal grant around K-12 literacy, and we have networks of districts across the state that are working on, I think we have 2 working on elementary, we have 3 working on 3-8, and then we have 2 working on high school. Those have very targeted approaches to read, apply, and work on writing, and we are spreading the learning that they're doing across the state through the reading networks and then through the Reading Summit every year. So they presented a couple of months ago on what they're learning and what they're providing so that we can spread what they're understanding across the state, in particular in the writing. Yep. So I want to talk through our student groups. When we look at our student groups, it stuns me that we are in a space with students with disabilities over time. And the fact that we are going to have to take proactive efforts, that student group in itself is stunning, but you're going to see that spread across our English language learners. You're going to see that spread into our Black and African American. And we dropped 4 to 6 points across our racial and ethnic lines. So our gaps are widening with our student groups. And that is very clearly distributed in our ELA results in particular. And I'm just going to stick on the second grade moment, because if our second graders can read, comprehend, and apply, they build knowledge at a much faster rate. And this is where our biggest gap was. So when we think about our second graders in 2019, we had 21% below. We actually have 35% and that 44% approaching. So we have a significant drop in our second grade, our youngest learners through the pandemic last year. What is so important to understand where that breakdown is happening with our youngest learners is to collect that universal reading screening data. Because we don't actually know when we collect the TCAP data, is it the ability to read or is it the ability to apply and understand what I'm reading to the tasks? When we have started collecting that universal reading screener, all districts were required to give that this fall. We are collecting it from their providers right now. We will have a good understanding not only of can they read, but the parts of reading. So can I do my letter naming? Can I read fluently? Do I hear sounds? We're going to have that breakdown across the state and be able to make those comparisons on the ability to read, which will better help us target the second and third grade, which we have never been able to do in the past. Is it the actual ability to read? Is it the comprehension of reading? Or is it those applied tasks you talked about? And how do we really get in and target those spaces efficiently? So it's going to be very important for us to take that universal reading screening data with this data, pair it together, and really deeply work with our districts to understand what is actually happening in second and third grade classrooms. So one of the pieces of that is the Reading 360 initiative. We had almost 10,000 teachers over the summer in pre-K-5 go through 2 weeks of training. 1 week of the cognitive science and understanding the science, and then 1 week in cohorts working together to say, what does that science mean with my instructional materials when I teach every day? So we had over 10,000 teachers in that space. We also had 117 EPP professors who went through that course as well. So not only did our teachers go through that course, but our teachers of teachers went through that course this summer. But we know in research that's not enough. It's not enough to train teachers over the summer and then put them back in the classrooms. We have 100 districts who received grants to have coaching in their districts for those teachers when they go back to the classroom. And we are currently working through contracting right now for the districts to select their coaches and their coaching providers to support that work through the school year this year and the school year next year. So our teachers are getting very intensive support on that best practice cognitive science approach to teaching reading. And that is going to, the first pass at teaching reading, that's going to help our students learn in a much better rate. Our students who are struggling both had summer programming, and then Tennessee All-Core is starting as we speak. So districts will have 1 to 3 ratio tutors. I think we have 90. My team will kill me because I'm quoting numbers that I am not an expert on. But I think we have 90 districts that have signed up for Tennessee All-Core grants, which are matching grants for districts to provide high dosage 1 to 3 tutoring for our students. Those tutoring sessions target right in on that individual student need using that data point like that universal reading screener and then a benchmark that looks at their comprehension and really hones in on what those exact students in those 1 to 3 ratios need and provides that high dosage, which is 2 to 3 times a week throughout the school year. So those are 2 programs that are really digging into that approach. And then we will have
those 10,000 teachers, what percent did that represent of the teachers that teach reading?
Yep. So any teacher who teaches pre-K-5 was eligible to attend. We estimated in the pre-K2 space, we had 35,000 teachers who were eligible to teach that. Yeah, so about a third, given that we had some 4th and 5th grade teachers. We will run that training again this summer and the following summer. And those teachers were paid a stipend, and they're getting materials kits delivered to their classrooms. Yep.
2 quick questions. I think this is very exciting. I think the universal screening data is just going to be huge to be able to collect that at the state level and have more interim checks to see how districts are progressing with some of these acceleration efforts before the TCAP data comes in. But my first question is about sort of what you're starting to see there, knowing that, you know, I know this board approved any number of different options for districts to use. How hard is it going to be to look across screeners and have comparable data sets in terms of state level results?
If you talk to the school psychologists, like when the data is loaded and they're looking across, they feel really good about it. When you talk to the IT team about loading all these different programming files from the vendors, because remember the vendors are submitting them directly, the districts are not submitting them, and getting those files to talk to each other in the IT world has been a little bit of a challenge. That's what we're working on right now. But the psychometricians who are actually going to look at the data have put data parameters in place that they feel like they have a really good sense around that student growth percentile and those sub-tests that actually are normed across different vendor providers. There are a few tests that are not normed, but there are enough exact replicates like letter naming across
So
all
I'd say like by
fluency.
skill group and sort
Yes.
of standard you can see. That's great. Then my other just thought is on the EPP training piece, which I think is a big part of this too, and it's great that they were part of the summer training, is just thinking about how we continue to support and pick up on what changes they've made in their curriculum and courses to reflect, the foundations of reading versus maybe how they were teaching reading previously. And I'm sure that'll be something that hopefully gets picked up in the sort of 7-year cycle of review, but maybe the annual reports or some other way that we can have ongoing touch points with.
Yep, we are working to have a Tennessee Reading Research Center, and through where we are with that process, they will look at all of the screening data, all of the TCAP data, all of those input data by student ID numbers and EPP programs, and take that landscape analysis that's required from the Tennessee Literacy Success Act and start tracking that based on these different inputs and how that.
So recent graduates from different EPPs, like in our report card, we'll be able to see how they perform on various sort of literacy. Focus. That's good.
And
It'll be a little
Sarah-
bit lagging, but it's still good.
I think all the data is going to lag just a bit, unfortunately. I think the one other thing with EPPs that Michael Derline's team is running is we ran grants for innovation courses that align to the courses that our current teachers took this summer. Our EPPs are model courses for our aspiring teachers in foundational science of reading. So they are building model courses that then our EPPs across the state can pick up that are aligned to the same exact science and expectation from the summer.
That's great. Yeah.
Some data that shouldn't lag is you ought to be able to look at those 10,000 teachers that took the training and the effectiveness of them versus the 25,000 that haven't had that. That would be helpful.
Yes, agree. Anything else on literacy, or do you want to move forward to math? I want to make sure.
It looks like we're good for you to move on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So when we look at mathematics, we see a little bit worse of a picture. Only 1 in 4 of our students were proficient last year. You can definitely see the bump in the below and the approaching, significantly different from 2019 and 2021. I will say that research tells us that that's not surprising. Math drops faster and moves up faster than ELA. ELA takes much longer to drop, and it also takes much longer to recover, and our tests are not as sensitive to that drop in recovery as it is in math. We had an overall drop of 12 points in mathematics. What we saw across the board categorically is that math conceptual knowledge, understanding, and math notations were a definite category where our students struggled in places. We do have a math adoption going on this year. Our Tennessee Textbook Commission is doing a statewide math adoption around high-quality materials. We've had lots of feedback on the importance of having digital platforms that match in-person platforms, so that's definitely part of the approach that they're working on to make sure those math materials meet the standards that you guys adopted last year and have some of that statistical work that you put in place. And then the Tennessee All-Core supports. We are under final contract. As part of Tennessee All-Core, there will be a math program available to every district and every student who is part of Tennessee All-Core, which will do similar to that universal reading screening. It'll do iterative tracking of students' growth. So it'll place the student where they are specifically, track their progress weekly, give guidance to those tutors of what specific skills, what specific strategies in grades 1 through 8 that students need as part of that high dosage tutoring. So they're going to have very targeted tutoring sessions that are available through that Tennessee All-Core program. And very excited. I don't think the contract's dry, or I would tell you the vendor who's going to partner with us to do that, but we will have a partner available at no cost to all of our districts to support our students with that very tight tracking that will dig down and say, you're a fourth grade student. We're going to start at fourth grade. It will dig down in that skill and say, you lost that, kind of like a crochet hook, dig down to that second grade skill. You're missing this, and stitch it back up and then move them across and help the tutors on that very specific tutoring strategy. So really excited about that math support that's going to be embedded in Tennessee All-Core, because we definitely need that fast acceleration given that fast drop that we saw. As we look at our takeaways, again, we saw a significant drop in our third and fourth grade. We dropped from 44% to 31% in third grade, 46% to 34%. If you look at the below basic or the below category, we have 50% of our students that are in the below proficiency category. And we saw proficiency rates decrease twice for remote students than in-person students in mathematics. We did see somewhat of a stability, as you see across the bands, in that approaching, but we saw so many of those approaching kiddos drop into below, and so many of those proficient kiddos drop into approaching. So we definitely saw that fast, dramatic drop in mathematics. And while we were at 1 to 7 in economically disadvantaged in ELA, we are at 1 in 10 of our students at a proficiency rate in mathematics. So we definitely have some urgent, dramatic needs to work on in mathematics. And you're going to see categorically the same achievement gap across the board, but you're going to see that massive level of red in some places that is persistent. You're going to see it spike with our Black or African American students. You're going to see a spike in our English learners. And you're going to see that Black students were most impacted, with 67% scoring below and only 9% meeting grade level expectations. I'm going to pause on math for a moment. Questions, thoughts, comments on mathematics? It is going to be a critical year for us to look at core instruction. It's going to be a critical year for us to look at those just-in-time supports for mathematics. In particular, when we think about middle school students, where I'm starting to learn the complexities of math that I have to get to that high school and post-secondary work, and the gaps that we saw in the middle school, we definitely have to focus very quickly on that learning acceleration. One of the things that is most important for our districts is not to back up. When you have 50% of your students below, it's very easy to say, let's just reteach fourth grade. But then we never have the opportunity to get through fifth grade. So it's important for us to look at that Tier 1 curriculum and those just-in-time supports. So we do that crochet approach of going down, picking it up and picking it back, and not wholesale moving the instruction backwards, because there's no way to accelerate if we're not getting through the grade level content. So that is one of the key focuses in the math adoption, is making sure that those supports are in there to make sure our Tennessee All-Core has that very iterative just-in-time support, and that we are ensuring that math tutoring and math summer programming is very consistent and intentional for our students.
One comment that I want to add, because we know that there are a variety of issues that are at play in the decline in the numbers. Yes, the pandemic, huge impact, but there are other factors that are in there that are embedded in this, and it's year in and year out, because math has not been our strong suit in Tennessee for many, many years. And we've talked about this, not ad nauseum, but because it's important. The teacher shortage has a play into this, and certainly trying to find qualified teachers to teach math in our systems today is a problem. And so I don't know that we even know the true numbers of the decline in the math teachers. We know that EPPs are not able to keep up. So embedded in this, we know that's part of the challenge. So while we try to recover from the pandemic, we still have to recognize the fact that we have other factors at play, and that's just to name one that comes to mind. So I don't know that we have a way to capture that, and how many teachers are out there. I know that there's data that is collected by the department when there are exceptions that are made, there are waivers, permits that are provided, but I think somehow we need tackle that too. We know that, and it's all of us, again, together, trying to figure that out, but.
I will definitely send that request over to Rachel's team, Rachel May's team, and ask her if there's a way for us to parse that out. I think one of the exciting things that I'm thinking about this math placement is it's so directive on what to teach and how to teach the math for individualized students. One of the pieces of feedback we've seen with this vendor in other states is that aspiring teachers, alternative educators, can teach the math a little bit more strongly than without that program. So hopeful in that space,
Right.
but happy to get that data and target that data along with that. I know David had done some work with economically disadvantaged as well with our mathematics teachers, and I have some very personal experiences from Nashville in hiring middle school math teachers too. So that's a good flag, very good flag.
And of course, not to belabor this, but we've talked about literacy, and literacy affects every subject matter that is taught. And there are many educators that are out there that said that they did not learn how to teach their students. That just wasn't part of what was offered in the university. So we know that that's all being addressed, but I think we'll continue to see the effect of that for quite some time. But I just say that to remind ourselves that we can't just sit here and say the pandemic happened and we're going to recover like this. And we know we're not. We know we're still in the pandemic. So
Very good
let's just
flag.
be mindful of that.
Very good flag. We're going to see similar data with science. We're going to see proficiency rates that dropped by a third. We're going to see drops in science that were in remote learning, clearly because science is a hands-on approach. It's much different doing science in a remote setting versus science in a classroom setting. So that is definitely something we saw in our data, that those students who were doing science in a remote setting, we had definitely higher drops there. I think the exciting piece was the stream over the summer. I know I've seen a lot of you on our summer programs, getting to see some really innovative stream programs. We are continuing to partner with TSIN to expand those STEM designations to really strengthen that science approach in the classroom. But we did see a much bigger bucket of that approaching in that peach category in 2021 in our overall science than we did in 2018-19. And then when you look at our elementary, middle, and high school, similar to our math, you see a decrease in that elementary space, but you see a big difference in those middle school numbers, almost a double at the approaching and a 5% increase over in the below. So you're going to see a pretty significant space where proficiency dropped by 30% in elementary, 40% in middle, and a little bit less than 18% in our high school. So we definitely saw the impact in science and those applied skills in high school. And then the largest decline in middle school was 62% to 36% of students performing on track and master when we look over time, when we look at 2017 to 2021. So very excited to have that partnership with TSIN. I know Jean's team is building out significant resources around STEM and STEM designation. I don't know if you have seen the PBS programming. One of my math people has become a celebrity in the grocery stores because she walks out and she did all the programming for PBS, and all these children know her because they're watching her math lessons. So we are getting a lot of traction with that at-home support with PBS. And really, I think one of the highlights, and I'll not talk about summer camps much, was the STREAM component and really emphasizing and reinforcing the science and the STEM approach to teaching science in our summer programming. I don't think this is a little bit of a broken record. You can see the challenges with our student groups are very similar to our student groups that we saw across the board in ELA math. It just reinforces that our students experience that pandemic differently. We have gaps that are persistent, and we really have to target those gaps intentionally. You're going to see a little bit, we talked about our economically disadvantaged with reading and math. You're going to see some of those targeted approaches with summer programming to really hone in on our economically disadvantaged students in that student group. We have had a little bit of a restructure in the department. The special education department and the English language learners have come under my umbrella. So our ELL team is working right next to our literacy team and being very intentional about how to put those supports together. Our continuum of support, so our RTI, our acceleration, our summer programming, and our special education teams are working very intentionally together. So we're excited to have that coherent approach and hope that that overall focus more on our student groups, but it's definitely a need that we need to continue to work and think about. I'm going to move to social studies, which is a little bit of a unicorn in our data today. You're going to see some interesting pieces. Overall, our proficiency has increased from 30 to 36% in 2021. So we are on a track. We saw fewer declines, less than 3 points in other areas. And we really didn't see quite the drop in social studies that we saw in the other content areas. And we actually saw an increase in high school in our social studies scores. So we did see that middle school drop that we saw similar to that ELA math and science piece in those spaces, but we saw an increase in social studies, which is interesting when speaking to what content area might work well in a remote, hybrid, or in-person setting. It appears that social studies held its own pretty well across the pandemic year. We do have Best for All Central resources. I'm really proud of our director of Best for All Central. We have over 2,800 replacement instruction videos in ELA, Math, Science, and Social Studies, grade K through 8, that teachers can plug in and have those high-quality lessons every day. If there's not a teacher in that classroom, there is a lesson for them. There are summer packages. There are boot camps in case we have a 2 or 3 week shortage. So there's a wealth of resources on Best for All Central that connect those content areas. And then the civics program that Jean works on is a significant focus on our social studies work. But we did not see the decline in social studies quite as dramatically in the other content areas.
Why do you think that's the case, and what can you learn from that and take to the other subjects?
That's a great question. I think we're measuring a little bit of a different applied skill in social studies in our social studies assessments than we are in our reading, in our math, and our science. It's a little bit more global. So if I missed a piece, it's easier for me to perform well, where if I miss a critical piece of math, everything starts to unravel. So it's that Swiss cheese of instruction that students have. So for me, it's really digging in and seeing what is that hole and how do I fill that hole versus backing up everybody's Swiss cheese and trying to teach everybody's holes and that approach. I think social studies, it's a little bit more one-to-one, right? If I missed the unit on the War of 1812, I just need the content on the War of 1812. If I missed middle vowel sounds, that impacts my ending vowel sounds. It impacts how I apply my reading. If I miss slope, that impacts all kinds of things. I think that more complexity piece of that makes it a little bit harder to specify and target exactly where those gaps are and how they compound over time and over years. But I'm happy to research that and get back to you a little bit more specifically. So our student groups, this is similar. You're going to see a little bit more blue, a little bit more performance, certainly a little bit higher pieces, less drops. Definitely some improvements with our English language learners and our students with disabilities over time. You're not going to see those dramatic changes over the past year. I think one of the pieces that is most important about our data is that in the fall of 2020, we had predictions that the data was not going to come back well. And Jack said this at the beginning. Our governor and our legislature came together in January and really took a proactive approach with the summer programming, the learning loss legislation, and the Literacy Success Act. So we were able to be ready much more quickly. I think when I talk to my counterparts across states, they're thinking about how to do a summer program. We have already done a summer program for every district across the state. They are thinking about how to pilot a program, and we have a full program. That is that really proactive approach when we knew that we were going to have challenges. I think our data shows sharp declines, but that intentional targeted approach that attaches to those very specific pieces of data allows us to look at that learning acceleration that is going to take time. I think we definitely need to think about our youngest learners. We saw that faster drop and that faster gap, and they are our students who are going to have to recover before they lose more and more space. We have to target our economically disadvantaged students. That is a drastic change in their data points over the past year. And we know that recovery and acceleration takes time. But what I'm most proud of and what excites me is the collaborative nature. I think Bob, you talked about this earlier. We work together for the AMOs. The fact that everybody is working together, that everybody's thinking proactively, and everybody's coming together for a solution means we are in a different place in Tennessee than in a lot of different places. Our kids are first, and I think that proactive approach helps us move more quickly towards a very targeted acceleration. And we can see that very clearly in that 95% participation rate. We knew that it was important to get kids here, to understand what the data was really telling us, to understand what those student group gaps were, so we did. So now we have to come together and really dig into these acceleration models, to getting our staffing where it needs to be, to really helping look and focus on the needs of our schools and our children and move forward. As a department, we have three very clear trends. We have to work on our ELA, and we have to work on our reading, and we have to focus on those lower grades, and part of that is that universal reading screener that we talked about, understanding where we are with reading and really targeting reading at the earliest levels. Our middle school math is absolutely critical. That focus on middle school math, that getting our middle school math kiddos back on track so that they have the opportunities in high school and post-secondary that they need and don't have those repetitive gaps that create that gap in their overall opportunities. And our achievement gaps, as we said over and over again, we have to look at our student groups. We have to look at those individualized learning experiences for students and think at very targeted approaches to support our groups of students. We know that our districts have a look at the data too. They have to look at their data. They have to understand their data. And I said this a little bit earlier. We have to encourage our districts. We have to encourage our teachers to teach grade level content. They can't go back a year because that will be a back year forever. We have to work on those just-in-time solutions that accelerate learning, that don't push learning backwards. So we have to think about what is it that is grade level, how do we build from that prior level within the daily instruction, within the continuum of that year, or in that summer programming that gives them a little bit of additional time to be ready for that next year. One of the main solutions for that is this high dosage, low ratio tutoring. We are starting to see a tremendous amount of research that high dosage, which is that 2 to 3 times a week, 30 to 45 minutes, actual tutoring on content that is missed, that we know that is targeted and specific to that child, with 1 to 3 students in that tutoring group. That is a shift for our state. We have not done tutoring at a 1 to 3 level at a frequency that looks like that. So that high dosage, low ratio tutoring is critical for that just-in-time approach to making sure our students are moving forward. And then another place I am incredibly proud, and I feel good when I go to these meetings, is maximizing those federal dollars on student learning. We have done a really good job. I was in a meeting yesterday with CAOs, and they're like, well, we're thinking about putting some of our ESSER funds towards tutoring. We have 90 districts who have signed up for high dosage, low ratio tutoring grants and have programs and are implementing. We are in a faster and more accelerated space at responding to our students, and that's because of that intentional design around the recovery funds to focus on student learning and that really intentional support and funding dollars in those spaces. I also think the crisis management and response, that 200 plus guidance documents in the middle of coronavirus, that was not fun to experience writing that many documents during that time, but I think as we continue to hear from our districts and continue to hear, that was a huge difference maker for them. That level of support, that level of guidance, that level of strategy, that weekly communication with district leaders, that has really helped us build a collaborative culture. We are in this together. How do we support? How do we work together? I have had many, many, many phone calls with districts about, okay, let's dig in and figure this out. Let's figure out how we do this. Let's figure out how to support your kiddos in this situation. Let's figure out what happens if you don't have a math teacher. We have replacement instruction. Can we pull this out for you? A lot of conversation has really mitigated that loss in that support of communications, resources, and truly our investments. We talked about what does the data say, what are the inputs. Having that Tennessee Reading Research Center that studies Tennessee All Core. How are we moving forward? That studies those reading summer trainings. Is that making a difference for our universal reading screening data? Those kinds of studies will help us really understand what is making the difference. I think PBS stepping up and giving all kinds of content and continuing to dedicate content for our earliest learners, has been a tremendous impact and help in that collaborative nature that comes across in Tennessee. I also think the dedication of dollars, having over $4.5 billion to really dig in and think about the next several years in Tennessee and focusing those dollars on competitive federal grants for districts, competitive federal grants for our providers, thinking about the ESSER relief and all of the funding that is going to go into our work. I'm going to show you where that money's going specifically to target in that space. We have $121 million going to Literacy Success Act and Reading 360, $171 million going to that Tennessee All-Core and Summer Programming, $35 million to support that math adoption. That $35 million is similar to what I said about the coaching for the literacy implementation networks. We will provide grants to districts not to buy their materials, because a lot of them are using their ESSER dollars for that, but to support them in the implementation of those materials and coach those teachers on those best practices when they're in the classroom. And then $32 million to really talk about those online resources for LEAs. We have a focus on innovative high schools and those advanced courseworks, mental health and family resources, and then really thinking about those open source readiness spaces and the professional development for teachers. And then we have been recognized for our national Grow Your Own pipeline and some of the work we're doing to recover some of our staffing issues in the state. So that's where the investments are going specifically with our ESSER dollars to support the learning acceleration work in the state.
I know a lot has been done as far as to apply for these grants for the districts and here. How are we doing on actually spending the money? Because I think that's the key, is being able then to go out and implement it. How are we doing statewide and then district-wide?
I think we are moving at a pace. Obviously, spending money at the state level requires a significant procurement process, and moving that money through that procurement process, I think we are moving as fast as we possibly can to get that money in the hands of the supports and the providers and the implementation. We saw that with Reading 360. We had to get that money to a vendor to design that course, to make sure it was research-based, to make sure it was delivered by the smartest reading people in the country to our teachers, and we were able to do that very quickly. We moved that money to the district so that they could get their providers. They are already contracted with their providers and are implementing that coaching and training. So it's that stair-step approach of moving at the pace we can move, but also at the pace our district offices can move, because they're not used to spending this kind of money. What I've seen is that intentional thinking, which is important. It's not just, hey, let's build a bunch of stuff or spend a bunch of money and buy a bunch of laptops. There is an intentional approach that is happening right now to spending the money. Getting the money spent is a change management process, because we're not used to spending this volume of money, but that we are intentional about spending, and I think I can attest to that.
And I believe in the application that they have to submit to the department, that they do list their budget when we're looking at the LEA. They list their budget, and then they show where they are in the spending process. And I think we've all seen reports on ESSER 1, 2, and 3.
Yes.
Well, mainly 1 and 2, where they are with the spending of those dollars. And in some cases where LEAs did not apply for grants, and so we're sure they had their, I'm certain they had their reasoning why they didn't apply for certain grants. And it's a lot of money to spend in the first place. But, yeah, so there is tracking of that. So I think we've seen some of that.
Significant tracking. You all know Eve. Eve has spent a lot of time and has a lot of new team members who are tracking that expenses and making sure that we expend that money, but expend it to the intentionality that it was intended to do. I just want to dig into academics for just 1 second as we're moving towards the end of the shift to summer programming. We will invest more than $358 million directly to academic supports, to reading, to middle school math, to closing those achievement gaps. That focus is very targeted. It comes from that data. It comes from those spaces in that data that we know we need to support, whether it's that high dosage, low ratio tutoring, whether it's that training and support for both our teachers and our educator prep providers. We also have funds that are going directly to our families. So we are supporting our families with reading apps and reading supports. We are supporting our districts to host family literacy nights to help our families become partners, really targeting all stakeholders in our academic approach, but really investing intentionally in those areas that we saw those gaps in that data. So Reading 360 is that targeted approach for all of our younger learners, has pieces that support all of literacy, but really targeted at those younger grades. Really thinking about our all core and our mathematics. I have a person on my team that is solely dedicated to math tutoring, technical assistance, and supporting districts to stand up that program and really think about that intentionally, and then the Best for All website. So we have done some strategic work around academics. We continue to think about academics and continue to think about some of the things you've asked us to think about, is really digging in and figuring out exactly what's going on and being responsive to that data. But I think to that intentionality that we just talked about, it's about understanding where each district is, because each district is in a different place. They have different experiences last year. They have different needs. They have different results from different student groups. Really understanding the needs of their district, those students and those staff, and where that staff works, and really designing intentionally that multi-year plan, implementing that plan at a pace and intentionality that makes sense, and then monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting. I think is super important for us to continue to think about what is working and what is working well and what is making a difference, and really honing in and continuing to think about those strategies that are working well. I'm going to turn it over to Jack. I'm sure you have had enough of me for at least a minute.
Well, wait. Before you leave,
Oh, I'm coming back, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have right now.
well, in the event you don't come back, I really appreciate the sober, those numbers are what they are. But also, I think you're very active in the intentional spending. My mind immediately went back to Race to the Top. And I would say that was not intentional spending. I don't have any idea what happened there. I'm just, not that I would. But I feel pretty good about what your all's thought process is, that it is going to be intentional. We are, and it's complex. It is a hard deal. And I say all this because I think there's a lot of kids out there in Tennessee that's probably going to benefit greatly from what y'all are doing.
Thank you. I think we have some places where the monitoring and evaluation and shifting to what is working are lessons learned from Race to the Top. We did a good job deploying, but not did this work sustainably over time. I think one of the key parts that we're trying to learn from, and part of that Tennessee Reading Research Center, is what is working and how do we ensure that that sustainability is a critical part of this work.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Coons. So I will spend just a couple minutes now. I wanted to kind of pause and take a little bit of time to address a topic that I have gone back and forth and worked kind of closely with several state board staff on over the past several months. And that is a discussion about kind of what we know about the 2020-2021 school year, what we can potentially learn from that school year in terms of best practices, and what are some options that we may have at the state level, what are some options that you all have as a board, what data is available to kind of further dig in to that school year. Because what we've just seen were the kind of sobering test results and the state level and department level responses. But I did want to make sure that, that we ran through some of the options that are out there. If I can fix my binder here. No, I'm good. So I'm going to talk for just a minute about analyzing performance and best practices from the 2020-2021 school year. I wanted to hit on 4 potential data sources that we have available to us to begin to kind of unpack and examine the 2020-2021 school year. And some of these I have added here. Other ones are the result of what I know to be board members' kind of interest areas in terms of looking for best practices and lessons learned. So I'll start with the one that we kind of just spent time dissecting, which are the 2020-2021 TCAP data. I've mentioned this to those of you who are on the literacy subcommittee, but I wanted to make sure that I highlighted exactly how the department went about analyzing those results and kind of compared and contrasted that with what I know some of the questions have been since the release of this data about how we can kind of look at student performance. And I'll also kind of touch on, the district's role in that regard too. So all of the slides that Dr. Coons just showed from that school year, we're really looking at statewide averages and comparing statewide averages in each of the performance areas just year over year. That is different from looking at a specific unique group of students who may have scored in one performance category in one year and then following those unique students through time to see how those unique students perform. And I want to say that both of them are very important approaches to trying to analyze performance from that school year. The reason that the state took the approach to do it at the state level is that is the quickest and easiest way to kind of see where we need to mobilize efforts at a state level. When you look at how students change from year to year, and you start to look at those performance groups at the student level, you need to bring in a lot of other factors and control for a lot of factors that take a while, quite honestly, to perform that kind of analysis. It is equally as valid. I want to be clear about that, but I just wanted to call out how there is a difference there. We have the state level and district level TCAP data available on our website that is there to download, and it's not at the student level. And I'll talk in just a moment about potential options if that data is is wanted and how you can go about getting that data. But I did want to call out that the state level and district level data is on our data for downloads page. The second one, continuous learning plans. We have had a lot of questions about what those plans can tell us about the 2020-2021 school year. And I understand where those questions are coming from. And one of the things, though, I want to be clear about is what the TCAP data just showed us is that even though we may have had school districts that did a good job responding to the pandemic, and I want to give credit to that, we had school districts who through Herculean efforts, were able to ensure that students did not slip as much in learning as they possibly could. The statewide data shows that really none of that school year in terms of hybrid approaches, virtual approaches were ideal. If they had been, I don't know if we would have seen that drop in proficiency that we just took time looking at. And so while you can look at continuous learning plans, and they are available on our website for you to analyze, we did not take that approach to kind of identify best practices, because of what I just said about how I think the data is pretty clear that nothing was ideal. There may have been best practices for virtual instruction, but it didn't get kids to that same level necessarily statewide as in-person instruction would. And then the other thing I'll say about the continuous learning plans is just how truly unique they were and flexible, and how they were really designed for district context. And what that means is that it is hard to kind of look across them and draw out comparisons. But I do want to note two reports that we have provided to you all and are also publicly available on our webpage, the CLP mid-year and end-of-year report. And both of those reports do highlight districts and pull out some best practices and options that districts did employ during that school year to continue providing instruction to students. Finally, I'll touch just a minute on ESSER. I know that Dr. Coons just spent a moment discussing that. ESSER will be an informative place to look down the road in terms of trying to analyze best practices and evaluate the different recovery rates after the pandemic, the different acceleration rates in student learning after the pandemic. And I wanted to highlight kind of two specific initiatives that we have that can kind of serve as like the guiding light to attempting to kind of follow and analyze how ESSER impacts student accelerated learning. And the first is the Accelerating Tennessee ESSER Steering Committee. This is a steering committee comprised of 21 members, including members of the legislature. And it is really designed to kind of do exactly what I know several of you board members have asked, which is kind of looking at best practices in terms of spending, in terms of strategies that are within the buckets that are allowable, in trying to kind of examine how districts have approached spending their ESSER dollars and learn those best practices. That committee meets 4 times a year, and afterwards all of the meeting items are posted on our website. And so you can follow that link there, and you can kind of follow along in that committee process as it happens. The second thing I'll note is our Best for All districts. And I think it was perhaps Mr. Edwards that talked about intentional spending. The department's Best for All districts are districts that commit to spending at least 50% of their overall ESSER allocation on research-backed strategies to improve student academic performance. And that is that intentionality about the spending that we just got done discussing. That will be another indicator down the road to kind of really look and see for districts that use that money and really tied it to those research-backed strategies for improving student academic performance. How did they perform in their learning acceleration compared to districts who maybe were not Best for All districts? And then the final thing I'll note, and this is perhaps kind of the most useful of all of these in terms of identifying districts that may have performed better than expected last year, because we did have those. I think one of the things that we may not have spent enough time talking about just now during Dr. Coons' presentation is how we did have some districts that did grow in those individual areas. I mean, we discussed the statewide results, but we had some school districts, we had teachers, administrators, other stakeholders who overcame immense odds, and their students still grew on TN Ready. So I did want to mention that. And one of the places that you can start with to kind of learn about maybe where to focus efforts if you wanted to approach kind of a qualitative analysis of performance during that school year would be from our Accelerating Tennessee Tour Bright Spots Guide. And that is kind of the summary of the tour that we took this summer to kind of visit summer learning camps. And it has a lot of really useful anecdotes. It has strategies that, that schools deployed this summer in terms of their summer learning acceleration camps. So that is another good place to kind of turn. The last thing I'll say is going back to the fact that our TCAP data is available on our website. That is another place where you can look at that district level performance to try and draw out some school districts who may have performed better than average. And then again, perhaps through qualitative approach, begin to kind of unpack what they might have done differently. And so what I'll end on is potential next steps. I do want to call out the Department of Education Research Review Committee. This is something that the department has had historically, just kind of a body and a process for requesting data and acquiring that data in order to kind of answer those longer term, perhaps more complex research questions. I've linked to our data request form up here. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the groups in our state, such as the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. There are other organizations that do a really excellent job of taking some of those larger student-level data sets and asking those really important kind of research-oriented questions that I've heard come out of this board. And then additionally, you know, I'll mention the department's own research agenda that is kind of evaluated on an ongoing basis, and the fact that some of these questions, you know, absolutely could and do align with some of the same questions that we're asking internally as a department. And so that is kind of the end of my part. I will pause for any questions that you all may have, and then turn it back over to Dr. Coons for a discussion about summer learning camps.
So those districts that grew, what are 3 or 4 things that they did that made them grow compared to those that did not grow?
So one of the things that, and first of all, excellent question. One of the things I'll say that I'm sure was the case is they had a higher percentage of in-person instruction. I think that when you look across at the state level results that we looked at earlier in Dr. Coons' presentation, the districts that spent the majority of the year with the majority of their schools operating in person saw greater academic gains. Besides that, that's a good question. I think that's one that we're still unpacking, quite frankly.
It seems to me that would be very important to know, you know, from a lessons learned standpoint, what can we understand? If we're talking about it and we're saying these districts did it, let's find out what they did.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'll mention again, just the importance of keeping in, the context of that school year and how there were so many different learning modalities. I hope, and I'm sure a lot of you share the same hope, everyone shares the same hope, that we very soon get back to a time period where we are all in school 100% of the time in person, because we know that's what's best. And kind of in the same vein as what I discussed about the CLPs, it could be that some of those districts did things that they wouldn't have to do in a future year, and maybe that resulted in them growing, and it wouldn't have that same impact in a future year, because it's in a future year we're all back in person.
I agree that would be good, but I also think that we need to understand what was it that the districts that grew, ask them, what did you do different? Try and find out what they did uniquely, because we may be back in this situation, or there may be something that the other districts can learn that can take forward.
Absolutely.
Let me just jump in, because I think you kind of anticipated some of the questions, I think, from our members. Bob's reflecting some good ones there. I mean, I think it sounds to me that we'll have the ability to potentially put some of those requests in, whether it's through Tara or through the department, to see. I mean, because I do think some case study work would be really interesting and helpful, not only sort of retrospectively, but sort of in an ongoing space, because as Lisa was pointing out, I mean, this work is going to be continuously happening over the next few years, we hope, to accelerate, sort of to address those losses. And so not only knowing sort of what worked in the last year and a half for districts, but what's working now, the universal screener data, looking at some of the student level results in more of a case study, pick a few districts, for whatever characteristics, their performance, their size, their performance. We'll probably want to be back in touch on some of this in terms of additional research requests. But thanks for teeing that up for us, Jack.
You're very welcome. And Dr. Morrison, that's a great point, and kind of dovetails well with what I was saying about, how unique, and hopefully, how unique the 2020-2021 school year was. And the fact that we will have some easier comparison points very soon, which is some of that universal screening data that will really quickly and accurately isolate the districts that are accelerating student learning, rather than potentially just identify some districts that mitigated the unfortunate impacts of all the different learning modalities and the COVID-19 related school disruptions. So that's a very good point.
I had a couple of questions. If you look back, you went back to 2017, I think, if you go back, how far back do you have those numbers? What, 20 years, 10 years?
We have TCAP data going back as long, for quite some time. I'll note one of the reasons that you don't see 15, 16, I believe the year is. We're getting pretty far away from that year now, but that was another year where the grades 3 through 8, there were administration issues, and there is no grade 3 through 8 data available for that year. But once you go back prior...
The question that I'm asking is, have the trajectory before COVID, set that aside for a moment, are we moving the needle over a 10-year period? And you don't have to answer that exactly. I'm just raising it as a question. The second piece of that is, how do we compare to other states? Is there anybody that's really doing this and could put their numbers up there and you'd sort of go, wow?
So I'll address your first question in terms of just looking at, if you wanted to do a 10-year or 20-year longitudinal analysis of our TCAP data. One of the things that I will note is just the shift in our academic standards that you'd have to heavily caveat anything where you're looking back and looking at trends going back that far, because the standards that we analyze change and have changed. Something like the NAEP, which is generally regarded as a very accurate comparison across states of student academic performance, is certainly something that you can use. I'll call out the fact that for a while Tennessee was the fastest improving state on the NAEP, which is something that I'm sure board members who have been around for a number of years have probably heard about ad nauseum, so I won't go into that in detail here. And then in terms of comparing us to other states, I would kind of point to some uniform measure like the NAEP. One of the things that's hard is that every state has slightly different standards and different standardized tests. One of the things I will say, and Dr. Coons mentioned this in her presentation, we do know and feel very confident that we are one of the only states to put in place such monumental approaches to student learning acceleration. So I would elevate that in terms of our comparison to other states. Dr. Coons talking about her colleagues that are still asking how to do summer camps when we have already finished a successful rollout of summer camps in Tennessee and will continue to do so in the future. Any number of some of the other efforts that Dr. Coons covered, our 95% participation rate was one of the highest in the nation. There were states that could not get much more than a 50% participation rate. That 95% participation rate, which is the result of a lot of hard work by our educators and our stakeholders, that allows us to set that baseline and have an accurate picture of what the impact of the pandemic was in Tennessee, and know that when we then measure from that it's representative of all the students in Tennessee. I don't know, Dr. Coons, if there's anything you would like to add, because those were two really big and important questions, so I want to make sure to give you the chance if something to...
I think we definitely have to use things like NAEP. And I think what we see typically is a growth and a plateau and a growth and a plateau. It's how to break through that plateau and learning from others of how to break through that plateau, right? We were the fastest growing state and we started to plateau right before COVID. It's how to continue that acceleration at a clip that's sustainable over time so that we continue to grow and progress to close that gap between Tennessee and other states. So it's definitely something like the NAEP where you're having apples to apples measures on the assessment that shows this is what students know in Massachusetts, this is what students know in Tennessee, this is what students know in California, and you're doing that comparison. I don't know that we could take the TCAP to the Florida, and FCAT and do that kind of straight up comparison. But I think it's about, one of the things that I'm learning, and in my meetings with CAOs across the country, is we have to get to outputs, but we also have to measure leading indicators that get us to outputs. We can't just measure student achievement. We have to measure, similar to what Bob said, if they go to this course, what are we seeing in their classroom? Is their classroom instruction then impacting student achievement? So it's all of those measures in the process that we have to better understand overall.
If we look at this 10 years from now, there's going to be a blip on the COVID year. But will that, if we would go 10 out and 10 back, will we see, in your opinion, are we being effective and efficient in moving the needle to a higher capability or capacity for our students? And you don't have to answer them, just
I think we have to study more in the moment data to be able to keep that trajectory going. I think if we only study TCAP to keep TCAP to TCAP, there's so many inputs in the middle that we're missing to really make that change sustainable. So we have to start capturing more data in the middle and more of those inputs to know what exactly is working to get at that output that is sustainable over time. Because if we only just look at TCAP and say, okay, we had a blip in the year because of COVID, okay, we had this, we don't really know all of the pieces. Education is complex. I mean, Lillian said it, it might be math teachers that are the issue in this. They're complex and there's all kinds of data points. If we don't start tracking those data points a little bit more tightly, we don't really know what is making that year over year impact that we have to figure out. It's a great question. I think it's very complex to answer, but we have to do better at tracking all of those inputs to get to that output.
There are several people that want to speak, and I'm going to have Mr. Cobbins go next, and then Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. Just one question about the allocations of the ESSER dollars that you showed on the slide. When I look at the data that you showed and, great solutions that we're implementing, when I got to that slide, it was just a little concerning that only $17.8 million is going to mental health and family resources. So I was wondering if there's flexibility in that financial structure, potentially to shift dollars around. And my logic is really based on the fact that, these young people, have gone through something that no other group of young people have gone through in 100 years. And so they bring that, those adverse childhood experiences and issues into the school and into the classroom. And, all the allocation towards the academics and literacy and all those things, I think are really, really important. But, the baggage that young folks have acquired over the past almost 2 years, I just think warrants, some additional investment, in addition to the educators and administrators and everybody who's been shouldering that burden, but just knowing how much that can affect academic performance, it just seems like that should be a little bit more robust.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I'll let Dr. Coons respond if she wants to. One of the things I did want to call out too is, in addition to this, I'll highlight the Mental Health Trust Fund from last session, which is kind of designed to, get at what you're discussing there. Very localized, evaluation of needs and targeted addressing of those needs. And that is kind of also the goal of family resource centers. I've had the chance to visit a couple of them, one of them at Pearl Cone High School in Metro Nashville. And I will say that they are pretty incredible for the communities that we have seen that have done them really well. This isn't going to totally satisfy your question, but I'll say that is a lot of money, I think, for these facilities in terms of what they're doing and how far something like just making sure that students have like a safe place and an adult to talk to can go. Because as a former teacher, that's one thing that I kind of experienced myself. I mean, when we look at all of this money that we're putting into all these other efforts, when you talk about student mental health supports in family resource centers, sometimes it's just about making sure that kids have a warm coat to come to school with. And again, making sure they have a safe place that they can go and have an adult that they trust. And so also want to say I totally agree with you. I think any more money that we can allocate to help kind of students recover in any way they need to from the pandemic, whether it be academics or some of the other issues that they may experience, definitely is a good thing. I'll note too, in terms of the impact of the pandemic, school closures and not going to school in person for over a year is, I think, where a lot of the difficulty has come for some of our students that have been really negatively impacted. Yes, academics are important, but not interacting with your peers, not interacting with a lot of students in your age group is also really detrimental. So, again, in addition to these funds, just again, returning to in-person instruction, I think will also go a long way. Dr. Coons, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I think the budgeted amounts of money were very much budgeted in what the data said and what we heard from our districts and what they needed. So we definitely prioritize needs based on that data that we share, but we also prioritize the funds on what the district said they needed. I know that there are multiple braided funds going into that. Those are only our funds listed there. I can't speak to how much that is, but we definitely prioritize the buckets of money based on what our district said they most needed from us at that point in time.
Any follow-up, Mr. Cobbins, or can I pass it to Mr. Edwards? Okay.
Going back to what Larry was asking, so if we were to recreate the last 10 years on let's say English learning, and if we were to plot it, and then would that mirror what we would have hoped to, or any of us would expected to have seen over that 10-year period? Now, I mean, whether it's that, or but it would have been more of an EKG or something. But obviously.
I think what we saw was what Jack said. We were the fastest growing state. We saw this spike of improvement, and then we got flat. We were stuck in that flat, so we might have grown, and data and research people will tell you this in a much more succinct way than I will. But you will grow and then you will plateau. You have to continue that growth. We were in a plateau moment, and we were not growing before COVID happened in ELA specifically.
Do we know why the plateaus occur?
that's more my question of we don't study all of the data inputs for me to tell you it's this data piece or this data piece. There are a lot of different pieces, but one of the things we know about literacy is we were coaching teachers a lot on practice, but not giving them the materials to teach well and not having a sounds first approach. So we know a lot of the input measures. We have to start studying those output measures that lead up to, like the universal reading screener, like that, for me to better answer that question.
So I think I may, in my mind's eye, I may be wrong. But I get a sense that in reading, over 10 years, we've been basically flat.
We started to show a little bit of growth.
But if you start at the beginning and you start at the end, did we give up any of that growth? Or if the growth did occur, is it basically a very shallow growth? So if the thing is, we got to figure out, including looking at all that stuff, but just to start with, where I think Larry was, we at least ought to have some sort of expectation, or that we don't want to be here 10 years from now with the same numbers that we're getting. And I'm very impressed with what we're doing. But a board has very little. We're not operational. We're the ones who are just sort of sitting out there like all the other citizens are, kind of asking the same questions that everybody's going to be asking, except we're the ones sitting here. What do we hope it looks like realistically? And then how can we sit back and look at, because again, 10 years ago, if we looked at that actual outcome, we would say, really? We ought to be looking for something different than that.
My hope, and one of the pieces Jack didn't have up on the research side, is we are going to partner with that Tennessee Reading Research Center that better studies what we should expect and whether or not we're meeting what we expect, and can tell us in more real time whether or not we're doing the things to make that move so that we do have a difference in 10 years.
And that will come also with information of what we ought to be doing, like you say, and then how we're going to go do it.
Yes, exactly.
Got a lot of folks who don't. They're in LEA, so.
Right, we've got to tie that, what we now know, to strategy and deploy that strategy.
And the implementation.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, that's.
And the last thing I'll note, Mr. Edwards, just in terms of ELA, and going back 10 years and looking at what data looked like over the span of the past 10 years, one thing that we did not have was some of these very, very concrete supports and interventions that are in the Literacy Success Act. That was a historic, monumental piece of legislation that will ensure that students are screened using uniform screeners 3 times a year. The really, really important intervention coupled with that, support piece after 3rd grade, and things like even, legislatively requiring parents to be involved and districts to share resources with parents. I can say confidently that wasn't a requirement by law before this past, not this past special legislative session, but before the special legislative session in 2021. None of that was there. So just to say very definitively what we would expect the trajectory to look like in 10 years is for there to have been dramatic growth because of those new supports that have been put in place.
And I will say, in June 2021, one of the unique experiences my team had was to collect those family literacy report letters from every single district and charter school. So we have, and you can see them on that website, every single district's family literacy report that goes home to students who are at risk or have a significant reading deficiency. So there's a level of collection, a level of feedback that we have at this point as a result of the legislation, and a lot more data for that research center to study and help us understand what are those inputs than we've ever had before. So NAEP won't do it across other countries. We have the PISA for that.
Yes, but like thank you. Such exams and data points that allow you actually to benchmark against others.
So just like our blueprints for our TCAPs, there's blueprints for the NAEP that line up and help you understand different inputs and different components of that assessment. And then they do that comparison across states and that fastest improving and things like that on a 4-year cycle for
It's
fourth
4
and eighth
years.
grade.
That's I knew it was not frequent. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Is it 2 years? I'm sorry. I've got all these numbers sitting in my head, so I'm trying to think NAEP versus TCAP.
PISA, I think, is 4. Is that, yeah, so NAEP is every 2 years? Okay, great.
Sorry. And it's a sampling. Yeah. I think the one thing we have that is a national component, but we have to learn more about this, so I'm stepping a little bit out. Our universal reading screeners use national norms. So we will be able to measure fluency scores against national metrics. So when we say a student growth is meeting the expectation, it's a national expectation on the universal reading screeners. It's not a state level assessment when we look at those universal reading screeners. So we will have some pretty interesting national comparisons across that reading screening data. Once we get into a cycle and get it really clean and quality data, we'll have some really good national comparisons against our screening data 3 times a year. That's some of the reasons that the windows are so tight and some of the parameters in the reading screener, because that national comparison has to be there. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that. Moving on to the next part of your presentation, summer programming.
I have to say this is my favorite thing to talk about. We saw some amazing things. All of that data and that sombering data happened before summer programming. And one of the most unique things happened in our state over the summer is every single district in this state had a summer program. And we had a summer programming with a framework and expectations of these are the guardrails for your summer programming. And our district stepped up and did some of the most creative, unique, engaging, truly deep learning experiences through summer programming across our state. And so our summer acceleration tour and that Bright Spots guide highlight at a very high level some of those things. We will be releasing in January more of that case study approach that Sarah talked about, of some strategies that really worked and impacted our summer programming data. So we will be doing some case study approach. But it was incredibly heartwarming to go from school to program, seeing kids excited in June about being in school and learning reading and math. And we had to remember they're there because they're not good at this, right? It wasn't the high flyers in summer camps who are excited to learn to read. These are students who struggled, students who had gaps. And to see the excitement and the engagement and the true givingness of our teachers to really dig in and do the summer camps is incredible. A testament to our state. So it has really been a highlight, although I did get to drive behind the bus most of the time, and I put 5,000 miles on my car in 2 weeks. My husband was real happy with me, but it was incredible to go in and see, and I know I got to see lots of different schools and programs with some of you. So I just want to highlight that this really speaks to the capacity and the heart of our schools and our educators and the willingness to help our kiddos. We saw and targeting that economically disadvantaged group, we saw 95% attendance for our students who were categorized as economically disadvantaged, 96% for our overall total. That is not consistent with our year-over-year attendance data. So we saw an incredible participation rate from that group of students that we needed to target and focus. We saw that across our bridge camps. We saw that across our stream camps. We saw that all the way across the board. It was really exciting to see that engagement. It was really exciting to hear why that engagement was happening and what our districts did to intentionally think about that. But I will say this is the most important piece of data is the pre and post assessments. You will see that overall in ELA, we had 6 percentage points growth between the pre and post. And in our elementary, we really saw a bang for our buck in 7.34%. Not much in our middle schools. We didn't have tremendous middle school impact there, and we need to study that and improve our middle school opportunities. You'll see our math data spiked a little bit more quickly as expected. We had almost 11% percentage points growth. We did have 12 in the elementary, and that 6 at that middle school shows that we are starting to tackle that middle school spaces. So really seeing that increase, and that our economically disadvantaged students in middle school improved over our non-economically disadvantaged. So exciting that we did see growth where we were targeting and trying to accomplish.
Question. The engineer comes out of me.
Sure.
The data. I mean, this is fantastic, really is. But when you look at that, the pre and the post test, were these the same students that took the test
Yes.
at the beginning?
Yes.
The same students that took it afterwards, in the same number? I mean, all the.
If a student took it at the beginning but dropped out, they weren't counted in the pre and post growth data.
So what percent then of the students that started finished?
95.
Mr. Edwards?
I got a much more rudimentary. All right, overall improvement at 5.97. What is that? Is that the percent approaching the gap closure, or?
So these are sampling tests this past year. So they scored, let's say I scored 8 out of 10 in my first test, and I scored a 10 out of 10. That aggregate result between beginning and end was an increase of 5.97 percentage points. So I got 80% and then I got 100%. There was an average growth of about 6 percentage points.
Or if you got 20% and you
Yes.
got.
Yes.
So there were a total of 10 questions?
Yes.
Okay. And how did you determine what the questions would be?
The 10 questions were sampled based on the blueprint maps and the prioritized standards and gaps.
Okay.
Were they the same questions at the beginning and at the end?
They were the same blueprint questions, not the same exact assessment questions for security purposes. So some of those pre-tests were given paper pencil, so they were printed. So there wasn't the same security level that you have in TCAP. But if I was measuring single-digit addition with this question, I had a single-digit addition question here.
So, all right. Is it, so on that, my 6 points. So we're not really trying to calculate, did we close the gap, or we shortened the gap, but we didn't close the gap, we made improvement.
Yes, especially this summer.
So how do we know from this how much remediation is going to have to occur to get that student out of the hole and back on full track?
Given that every single student in the state didn't miss the same content and their Swiss cheese gaps are different for every single student, that's very individualized. It really is truly individualized.
Yeah,
So
but they're all part of our ward.
that's right. That's right.
So how do we fix it?
I think it has to be a combination. The goal of summer programming was to give students additional time in small groups to start that learning recovery process. I think when those students go back into their classrooms and we're working on benchmarks, universal screening data, those tutoring all core, we have much more targeted specific rates of that just-in-time learning. Summer programming is designed to be more of that catch-up opportunity from what they missed from the prior year, not that learning acceleration model that moves them in that just-in-time approach. They're going to need both of those things. I don't think we've ever experienced this to say in a predictive model, if you get 6 weeks of summer school and 42 hours of high dosage, low ratio tutoring, you're going to be on track. Like, we don't have predictive modeling to do learning acceleration after something like a pandemic.
But we can measure it over time.
Yes.
And know
That's right.
we're closing it.
That's right.
If the kid's going to get across the finish line.
That's right.
Oh.
I think you're going to need multiple data points tracking that student in multiple spaces.
We could go school year round too.
So I'm going to move
okay
to
with
the
it.
next slide. And talk about the amount of money spent and the impact. We did spend over $116 million in allocation for students. One thing that really targets that economically disadvantaged group is that transportation. We heard that qualitatively time and time again, that transportation got our kiddos there who wouldn't have otherwise been able to get there. That investment was significant. I don't think there's a district that would tell you that they don't need transportation for that summer programming. And that transportation really changed that attendance rate. You said how many kiddos? Having that bus that picked them up and dropped them off and that ensured consistent transportation really made a huge difference, in particular for those students whose parents work, couldn't pick them up, needed that consistent way and expectation to go to school. That transportation really, we heard that over and over and over again. And as you heard two of our district's directors testify at summer session, the transportation is a critical funding source for them for summer programming.
What % of the students that were eligible did participate?
I don't have that data. I can get that to you.
How many total students participated? Sorry.
Do I have that, Jack? Yeah. Yeah, we had 120,000 students.
Did each, I don't remember asking this before, did each LEA or school develop their own curricula?
So they had some options. They could use their own materials, or we had Bridge Camp materials. So we saw a lot of different things. So when we talked to Dixon, they implemented the materials off of Best for All Central, and they used those. Some districts said, you know, we didn't get to the last 2 units in our ELA or our math, so they extended that out. Some districts, I know when we were up in First Tennessee, a few districts said, you know what, this is something they absolutely need to go to this grade, in particular in math. We are rerunning this unit in summer programming to give them additional time and smaller group support. So they worked within their adopted materials or used the state-provided materials on Best for All Central.
Okay. They had the option. Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions?
Well, question and a comment, I guess. You mentioned that there's going to be some case studies coming out of the summer camp work in
Yes.
January. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? I know we've been in touch across staff because we've got a research fellow doing a little bit of qualitative work too, but I don't think it's duplicative. So,
Sure. So the Bright Spots guides just highlighted some of the great strategies that districts took. What we are going to correlate is strategy to outcomes on that sample assessment pre and post test. And then, for example, making sure teachers had materials when they came and they weren't doing lesson preparation every day for summer programming has shown a significant difference. So what's a case study on how to make that work and how to make sure your teachers are prepared for lesson prep every day and what that did for districts. So we'll have 10 different strategies and case studies with districts on each of those strategies that had impact on the programming.
great. And just a note for our board, we have a research fellow who's just talking to a handful of districts, I think half a dozen that TOS had recommended in terms of places where they thought best practice and summer camps had been successful, and just to try to learn a little bit more through interviews and qualitative sources.
Yep.
So that'll be great to have.
Happy to connect her to our team too so they can share.
Definitely.
Yep.
So what was the split between the sort of the learning loss camps and I see the dollar split, but the number of students between the learning loss and those that were sort of accelerating?
I don't think we have a split between learning loss and acceleration. I think what we saw for most districts is they let any kiddo come who wanted to. So they targeted those kiddos who needed to, and their data showed that they were prioritized by need, either economically disadvantaged or proficiency rates. But what we heard time and time again is that they would let any student who wanted to come.
Would that be information that we could get?
Yep, absolutely.
I think that would be
Yep.
really good to have.
Yep. Yep. How many were at risk versus how many were in acceleration mode? Yep. Yep.
Great question. Other questions? Back to you for the continuation.
I'm at the thank you slide.
We should be thanking you. Thank you very much. Great presentation, lots of detailed information, answering all the questions.
Happy to do it and happy to follow up on those
Dr.
data
Coons.
asks.
Thank you, and Mr. Powers.
Yep. Thank you, guys. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Next up is, excuse me, Todd Matt. See, I'm getting tired. I'm not doing all the talking over here. Licensure actions, Mr. Todd Madison. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, board members. Todd Madison, staff attorney for the board, with Alex Anderson and Candace Carter, also staff attorneys for the board. We have the staff recommendations for licensure actions. At this time, we'll take any clarifying questions and items to pull for further discussion at tomorrow's meeting.
No, I can hear you, but I'm not sure that your microphone is on. Is it green?
It's green.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Eby says you're too tall. Are there any questions, licensure action questions? Aha.
Different days since Wendy's been gone.
Well, and I do believe that they've done a much more thorough job in presenting the cases and giving the background of why you're making the recommendation that you're making. I think that's very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so we're not going to hear any issues or questions or comments tomorrow in the board meeting. This is the opportunity, if there are any that you are concerned about, or you, well, you better not, no.
We should take this opportunity, though, Angie, maybe. I mean, we did quick introductions at the July meeting, but I know Candace wasn't able to be with us. Allison's not with us today, and she was with us in July. But why don't you do one more quick intro, because we're so excited about our new team members on the legal side of the house. They've jumped right in.
Sure. So the State Board Law Firm, as some have called it, we're so excited to have additional support for this work, and I just want to thank our board members who really raised this up to the legislature. Nathan James, who is not here today because of special session, but everyone has worked really hard over the past few years to get us additional resources. Obviously, you all know Todd Madison. He's our lead staff attorney. Candace Carter comes to us. She is also a staff attorney on our team, and Alex Anderson, also a staff attorney. And then over here we have Jacob Williams, who is a paralegal on our team. And then Allison Thomas, who was here but was not feeling well, so she's returned home. But I know she's watching, and she was here last time, so I think a lot of you all got to meet her in July, but she's another paralegal on our team. So very excited about this team.
And I'll just tell you, they're energetic. They have so many great ideas. Case review has never been more fun.
Get ready for next month.
I'll be ready.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments before we move into adjournment?
And I'm sorry that TDOE left because actually this was a comment for them. But I've gotten some recent correspondence and concern about the implementation of the Tom Cronin Act. If you recall, this past year, Tennessee was #1 in the nation in childhood obesity, and we passed the rules to support the Tom Cronin Act law that had, I think, strongly encouraged to. You're back. All right. I just want you all to hear this. So. I've had some concern recently expressed with regard to the implementation of the rules and the law of the Tom Cronin Act that at least some of the districts are challenging because there's no consequence associated with not doing the 2 30-minute sessions a week and getting the hour. And so that's something that gives me concern, again, because, like I say, Tennessee is #1 in the nation in childhood obesity. You talked before about, academics are all, are important, but there's other aspects, the mental health, physical health is just as important. And so I just bring that up to this board and to the department, and I think that's something that I would like to look into, get more information on how that's being implemented and what the concerns are, and what can we be sure that our students are getting the physical education that they need.
Absolutely, and Mr. Eby, I know and appreciate your passion for students getting the proper physical education that they need. I can certainly take that question back to our school nutrition folks, our health and wellness folks, just to make sure I understand. I thought we were going to talk about the waiver for the endorsement piece of it, not the not the minute requirement part of it, but you're. And forgive me because I missed, I think, the beginning part of that. But your question is, Could you just kind of state your question?
Basically, that's what I'm hearing from physical education, elementary physical education teachers, that the intent of the 60 minutes a week, the 2 30-minute classes, that at least some districts, I understand, are maybe not fulfilling that to the extent that they're telling their teachers that they're not going to, because there's no consequence if they don't. Others seem to be taking kind of advantage. I don't understand this totally, but maybe not the full 60 minutes into what we call full physical education. So I'd just like to understand how it's being implemented, the rules are being implemented across the state, and what the issues are, and what we might need, what encouragement we might need to do to be sure that our students are getting that physical education that they need in the elementary levels.
Absolutely. I can follow up with that. I mean, there's two things I want to note. One is just that, Lori Paisley at the department and her team do a lot of monitoring and are very in tap with PE coordinators across the state, and are certainly kind of monitoring that piece.
I'd be glad to get you specifics and get those if that would be helpful.
Sure, and because it is a local, school districts are meeting those requirements locally in a variety of ways. The other thing I meant to mention is just to make it clear, we are in a place where there is still, for this school year, the ability to request an endorsement waiver for that portion of Tom Cronin, but it does not excuse the time requirement from still being met. And the assumption is, if you are employing someone on the waiver, it's so that you can meet the time requirement. So just wanted to make sure we stated that too, but certainly I can follow up and ask.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Closing comments? Great discussions today. I have to read another statement. The purpose of the Committee of the Whole having been fulfilled, therefore I declare it and the board adjourned. Thank you very much.